My name is Amanda Reed. I'm 32 years old, and this is what happened in Vicksburg, Mississippi. A nightmare I never imagined could become my reality. I had always been drawn to the mysteries of the past. When Marcus Hale, my steady and skeptical boyfriend, and our old friend Rick Lawson proposed an RV trip to explore the abandoned campgrounds near Vicksburg, I couldn't resist. I craved a brush with history, even if it meant confronting ghost stories whispered around campfires. We were heading to an old campground on the outskirts of Vicksburg, a place steeped in both Civil War history and local lore about a spectral woman known as Lady Charlotte, a ghost in a white dress whose tragic fate was said to be interwoven with unspeakable darkness. From the moment we set out, I felt a mixture of excitement and unease. The RV was our sanctuary on wheels, albeit an aging one with a tendency to malfunction. On the first night, as we parked near the ruins of an old military outpost, I began to notice small oddities. The radio emitted nothing but static punctuated by incomprehensible whispers, and when I awoke in the middle of the night, I found personal items inexplicably rearranged. Marcus dismissed these signs with a scoff, a skeptic to the core, but my gut told me something was off. Despite the minor setbacks with our equipment, we pushed on, exploring the remnants of history by day and sharing eerie campfire tales by night. Marcus was always pragmatic and brave, though his temper occasionally flared when confronted with the inexplicable. Rick, charming on the surface with his easy laugh and adventurous spirit, seemed oddly fixated on uncovering the legend of Lady Charlotte. I couldn't shake the feeling that Rick's interest in the paranormal went beyond mere curiosity. His secretive glances and hushed phone calls hinted at darker motives, but we trusted him until everything changed. One evening, drawn by an irresistible pull, Rick convinced us to venture further into the ruins, a site reputed to be where Lady Charlotte met her tragic end. The air grew unnaturally cold as we navigated the narrow, overgrown paths. I remembered the silence pressing in on us, punctuated only by the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. Then, out of nowhere, the atmosphere shattered. A group of rough-looking locals, faces hardened by life and shadowed by something far more sinister, emerged from the darkness. They spoke in low, guttural tones, and it quickly became clear they weren't just curious wanderers, but members of a violent faction rumored to be connected to a cannibal cult, a remnant of ancient, twisted traditions. What began as a tense standoff escalated in moments. The locals, brandishing crude weapons, attacked without warning. Marcus reacted instinctively, pulling me behind him as we ducked for cover. In the ensuing chaos, amid shouts and the clash of fists against flesh, I lost sight of Rick. When the tumult finally subsided, I searched desperately, calling his name into the oppressive darkness, but there was no answer, only the echo of our fear. We eventually retreated to our RV, our hearts pounding, minds reeling from the brutality of the encounter. Marcus, his face etched with worry and anger, insisted we contact the local authorities. But the calls went unanswered, the lines dead or met with dismissive voices who claimed we were exaggerating the threat. It was as if the area itself had chosen to forsake us. Days passed in a blur of anxious searching and mounting tension. Every unexplained noise, every shadow that lingered too long, sent shivers down my spine. I spent sleepless nights poring over local records and whispered legends in dusty libraries. I discovered that Lady Charlotte was no mere ghost, but a symbol of unspeakable torment. A woman wronged in life, whose spirit was said to be bound to the land by diabolical forces. And then I found it. Evidence that Rick had been in contact with the cult. He had believed that by invoking Lady Charlotte's spirit, he could tap into powers beyond our understanding. The realization of his betrayal cut deep. One night, as I ventured out alone to scour the area for any trace of Rick, I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. The chill in the air deepened, and before I could react, rough hands grabbed me. I was dragged into the darkness, struggling futilely as a heavy blow knocked me unconscious. When I awoke, I found myself in a grimy, dimly lit room within an abandoned building that reeked of decay. My wrists were bound, and every ache in my body screamed in protest from the rough treatment. Figures in dark robes circled me, members of the cult, their eyes alight with a fanatical gleam. Their leader, a gaunt man whose voice dripped with malice, spoke of rituals and sacrifices. They wanted me as a conduit to summon Lady Charlotte's tormented spirit, convinced that her presence would bring them closer to unimaginable power. The torture that followed was both physical and psychological. They demanded answers about Rick, accusing him of betraying their sacred purpose. Every time I pleaded for his name, I was met with derision. My captors reveled in my fear, and each lash of pain felt like a descent into a personal hell. I realized with a grim clarity that my ordeal was not just about survival. It was a battle against an evil that blurred the lines between the natural and the supernatural. Somehow, amidst the relentless torment, Marcus appeared. I remember the rush of relief mingled with terror as he burst into the room, his eyes burning with determination and rage. Despite his own injuries, a deep gash on his arm and a bruised face from a previous scuffle, he fought his way through the cult members. The scene was chaotic: shouts, the clatter of makeshift weapons, and the overwhelming stench of sweat and blood. In that violent struggle, I saw Marcus confront not only the cult, but also the monstrous legacy of Lady Charlotte that they sought to harness. In the frenzied melee, Marcus managed to overpower a few of the cultists, and I was freed from my bindings. We fled through a labyrinth of crumbling corridors and dark passageways, our escape punctuated by the sounds of bodies falling and agonized cries echoing behind us. Outside, in the cool night air, the horror of the situation hit us both. I was trembling, my body aching from the abuse, while Marcus, though victorious in our escape, looked every bit the scarred warrior. His eyes held a mixture of anger, pain, and the dawning realization of the terrible cost of our adventure. We sought refuge in an abandoned chapel near Vicksburg, a place steeped in grim history and rumored to have been the site of dark rituals. The building was a decrepit shell, its stained glass windows shattered, and the altar defaced by time and violence. As we barricaded the door and attempted to tend to our wounds, I couldn't shake the image of Rick's empty spot in our lives. Had he been sacrificed in one of their rituals? Or worse, had he been possessed by the malevolent force they worshipped? I found no answers, only a void filled with dread and betrayal. The next few days were a blur of recovery and harrowing investigations. Marcus and I managed to contact a sympathetic local historian who recounted old legends of Lady Charlotte and the dark cult that once terrorized the area. He mentioned that those who tampered with forces beyond their control often paid a steep price. The historian's words haunted me, each one a grim reminder of our irreversible descent into this nightmare. Our situation was desperate. The local authorities remained indifferent, if not complicit, leaving us to fend for ourselves in a region where trust was as scarce as mercy. Every rustle in the wind, every inexplicable shadow in the corner of my eye, now felt like the specter of Lady Charlotte lurking, waiting to exact her sorrowful vengeance. Marcus, though physically weakened, never wavered in his determination to protect me. His loyalty was unwavering, even as I struggled with feelings of guilt for having dragged us into this mess by trusting Rick's misguided ambition. Late one night, as Marcus kept watch outside the chapel, I sat by a broken window, nursing my wounds and trying to piece together what remained of our shattered world. The silence was suddenly broken by a faint, sorrowful wail, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. I turned, and there, at the edge of the chapel grounds, stood a figure in a flowing white dress. It was Lady Charlotte. Her appearance was ethereal, yet marred by anguish. The temperature around me plummeted, and I felt a profound sorrow mixed with menace emanating from her. In that moment, I understood that the cult's rituals had not only endangered us, but had also unleashed a restless spirit whose pain was as palpable as her wrath. I shuddered, realizing that our escape might only be temporary and that the darkness we had encountered could be following us, ready to resurface at any moment. Marcus returned soon after my silent reverie, his face drawn and eyes clouded with worry. He informed me that while searching for additional help, he had found traces suggesting Rick might have been taken deeper into the woods, possibly to a hidden ritual site. With our options dwindling and the malevolent presence growing stronger by the hour, we made the painful decision to venture out and search for Rick, even though part of me feared what we might find. Our journey into the dark, tangled backwoods was a descent into a world of primal fear. Every step was a struggle, our path lit only by the weak beam of our flashlights and the light of a crescent moon. The oppressive silence was punctuated by distant, echoing cries and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Marcus led the way, his resolve unbroken despite his injuries, while I clung to hope that we could still save our friend and perhaps put an end to the curse of Lady Charlotte. In the depths of the forest, we finally stumbled upon a clearing marked by remnants of old ritualistic symbols etched into the earth. It was here that we found evidence of Rick's presence. A torn scrap of his jacket caught on a thorny bush, smeared with blood and dirt. The reality of his fate hit me like a tidal wave. Our search turned frantic, every rustle in the brush making our hearts race. And then, in the distance, we heard a muffled cry, Rick's voice, desperate and pained. Rushing toward the sound, we discovered Rick tied to a crude wooden stake, his face contorted in agony and fear. Before we could reach him, however, we were ambushed by a group of cultists. In the ensuing melee, chaos erupted. I watched in horror as Marcus fought valiantly, his every move a blend of raw determination and desperation. I managed to break free from my own bindings and join the fray, but the violence was overwhelming. Amid the struggle, I lost sight of Rick once more. A sharp blow knocked me to the ground, and when I came to, I saw nothing but the chaos of shouting figures and the relentless pursuit of the cultists disappearing into the darkness. I staggered back to the chapel with a broken heart and battered body, where Marcus and I regrouped, our hope diminished. The horror of that night was etched into our very souls. Rick was gone, either sacrificed to the unholy rituals or snatched away by the malevolent spirit of Lady Charlotte. The betrayal, the violence, and the supernatural dread had left us scarred in ways we could never have foreseen. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and I attempted to rebuild our lives, each day haunted by memories of the terror in Vicksburg. The local community, steeped in suspicion and fearful of old curses, turned a blind eye to our plight. I tried to find solace in writing down every detail of our ordeal, hoping that by telling our story, I could exorcise some of the lingering darkness. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lady Charlotte's sorrowful visage and felt the sting of betrayal that Rick's ambition had wrought. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I catch a glimpse of her at the edge of my vision. A reminder that the past we disturbed was not easily forgotten. Marcus remains by my side, a silent guardian against the nightmares that still lurk in the shadows. And though we have escaped the physical grip of that cursed place, I know in my heart that some spirits, like the ones we encountered in Vicksburg, never truly let you go. This is my story, a tale of survival, betrayal, and the unrelenting darkness that can lie just beyond the familiar. And every night, as I lie awake in the silence of my new life, I wonder if I'll ever be free of the horrors that haunt me from that cursed land in Mississippi. My name is Jason Moore. I'm 45 years old, and this all happened along Black Creek Road in Mississippi, a journey I embarked on to find solace and perhaps redemption in the midst of unspeakable horror. After years of working as a journalist, trying to piece together stories that sometimes cut too close to the raw nerves of human suffering, I withdrew from the chaos of the world. I bought an old RV. Its faded blue paint and constant mechanical glitch is a perfect match for my battered soul. I craved isolation, and somewhere in the backwoods of Mississippi, I believed I might find it, and maybe even uncover the truth behind a disappearance that had haunted local whispers for decades. I left the last vestiges of my former life behind as I drove deep into the swampy wilderness along Black Creek Road. The further I got from the familiar highways, the more the RV began to groan under the strain. Its engine coughed, and strange, unidentifiable sounds echoed around me. It wasn't just the old machine failing. Something about the environment itself felt off. Soon, I noticed odd footprints circling the RV, and on the trees nearby, crudely carved symbols that looked disturbingly deliberate. At night, I'd sit outside under a starless sky, the distant, mournful moans of the swamp filling the silence, as if warning me to turn back. My search for answers began with an abandoned logging camp I stumbled upon while exploring a narrow, overgrown path. The camp was little more than a collection of rotting cabins and rusted machinery, a forgotten remnant of an era when men once toiled the land. Among the scattered debris, I found a weathered journal. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, belonged to a local resident who had vanished without a trace decades ago. The entries spoke of a secretive cult that worshipped a being they called the Hollow Man, a gaunt, spectral figure with hollow eyes and a presence that drove men mad. The writer detailed rituals meant to bridge the mortal world with something far darker, something that seemed to lie just beyond the veil of sanity. Every night since, my dreams have been invaded by visions of that figure, the Hollow Man. In my sleep, I saw him standing in the murky depths of the swamp, his eyes empty and sorrowful, yet filled with an eerie intensity that made my skin crawl. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the line between hallucination and reality blurring until I could no longer trust my own mind. My RV, already unreliable, began to fail me in more than one way. One morning, after a restless night filled with unsettling sounds and the rustle of unseen creatures, I discovered that the engine had been deliberately tampered with. It was as if someone, or something, wanted to trap me here, forcing me to leave behind the relative safety of my mobile sanctuary. With the engine rendered useless, I had no choice but to abandon the RV and continue on foot, deeper into the swamp where the air grew thick with moisture and dread. I tried reaching out to the local authorities when I arrived in the nearest town, but my calls were met with dismissive tones or outright hostility. The people here seemed to prefer silence, their eyes narrowing whenever I mentioned the cult or the mysterious disappearance. I began to suspect that fear, or perhaps complicity, was woven into the very fabric of this region. As I ventured further into the heart of the backwoods, I could feel a malevolent presence watching me. I caught sight of shadowy figures at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. I began to sense that I was not alone. The swamp seemed alive with secrets and danger, and every rustle in the underbrush made my pulse quicken. Then, one sweltering afternoon, while investigating a clearing marked by ancient, ominous symbols etched deep into the earth, I was ambushed. Rough hands grabbed me from the shadows. Before I could react, A sharp blow to my head sent me spiraling into unconsciousness. When I awoke, I found myself in a dank, dimly lit room, my wrists bound with coarse rope. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and sweat. Around me, figures in dark, tattered robes chanted in low, guttural voices. Their leader, a gaunt man with a scarred face and eyes that burned with fanatical intensity, stepped forward. He spoke in a tone that chilled me to the bone, telling me that I had been chosen for a ritual, an offering to awaken the Hollow Man. The cultists believed that by using me as a focal point, they could summon the ancient evil that had long haunted these swamps. The days that followed were a blur of torment and terror. They forced me to watch as they prepared for their unholy ceremony, dragging me along a path of physical abuse and psychological torment. Every lash of pain and every whispered incantation pushed me further to the edge of sanity. The cult's chants filled the room, echoing off the walls like the sounds of a funeral dirge. I clung desperately to the fragments of my mind, trying to discern reality from the nightmare that had become my existence. In the midst of my despair, I found an inner strength born of sheer desperation. The torment and isolation, which once threatened to break me, instead ignited a spark of defiance. I began to strategize, biding my time, waiting for the moment when the cultists' vigilance would waver. That moment came on a storm-laden night when lightning split the sky and thunder shook the very foundations of the makeshift shrine where I was held captive. In the chaos of the raging tempest, a guard's attention faltered, and I seized the opportunity. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched free from my bonds and lunged at the nearest cultist. The ensuing struggle was brutal and desperate. I fought with everything I had, driven by the primal need to survive. Shouts, curses, and the clash of bodies filled the air as I managed to knock several of them down. In the tumult, I broke free and ran into the night, the cold rain lashing against my face. I didn't stop until I was deep into the tangled undergrowth of the swamp. The storm masked my frantic footsteps as I navigated by instinct and the fleeting glow of lightning. Yet, as I fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cult was not the only danger lurking in the darkness. Every now and then, in the periphery of the storm's fury, I felt a presence stalking me, a spectral force that seemed to transcend the physical world. And then, in a moment of heart-stopping terror, I encountered him. The Hollow Man. There, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning, stood a figure so gaunt and emaciated that it defied belief. His hollow eyes seemed to pierce straight through me, radiating a sorrow and malice that were indescribable. In that fleeting moment, I felt as if my soul were being laid bare, exposed to a darkness beyond human comprehension. The confrontation was both physical and psychological. I ran blindly through the swamp, every step haunted by that visage. My heart pounded in my ears as I struggled to escape, the relentless figures of the cult seemingly chasing me through the mire. At times, I could almost hear their chants mingling with the sound of the wind, a maddening cacophony that blurred the lines between the living and the dead. Exhausted, battered, and on the brink of collapse, I eventually managed to find a narrow, overgrown trail that led me back toward civilization. I stumbled into a small, isolated settlement at dawn, the first pale light of day offering little comfort against the horrors I had witnessed. Even as I sought help, the locals eyed me with a mixture of pity and fear. They spoke in hushed tones of the cult and the curse of the Hollow Man, as though invoking his name might hasten his return. Now, sitting in a cramped motel room far from the swamp, yet unable to shake the memory of those dark, murky waters, I document every detail of my ordeal. My body bears the scars of that stormy night, and my mind is forever imprinted with the image of the Hollow Man's hollow eyes. I have no way of knowing if what I experienced was a descent into madness brought on by isolation and guilt, or a genuine encounter with an ancient, malevolent force that dwells in the swamps of Mississippi. I find myself haunted by ambiguity. In moments of silence, when the wind whistles past my window, I can almost hear the cult's chants and feel the oppressive presence of that spectral figure. Sometimes, I even wonder if I'm truly free, or if the darkness that claimed so many lives in that forsaken place has followed me into my new life. This story is my confession, a record of a journey into the heart of fear, of a battle against forces that defy explanation, and of a man who, in his quest for solitude and truth, was forced to confront the horrors that lay hidden in the depths of the swamp. I share my tale not only as a warning to those who might be tempted to seek isolation in places where the past and the supernatural intertwine, but also as a reminder that some nightmares never truly end. They linger in the shadows, waiting for the moment when you're alone, when you're vulnerable, and when the darkness calls your name. Every night, as I lie awake listening to the subtle sounds of the wind outside, I remember that fateful storm, that relentless chase, and the unyielding gaze of the Hollow Man. And I wonder, with a dread that never leaves me, if the swamp still holds its secrets, waiting patiently for the next soul brave or foolish enough to venture down Black Creek Road. My name is Renee Ellis. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in the deep, dark heart of DeSoto National Forest, near a place the locals call Deer's Crossing in Mississippi. I was desperate for solace after a painful loss, and I believed that seclusion in nature would help me mend my broken spirit, and perhaps even spark the inspiration I needed for my next novel. I set off in my vintage RV, its faded paint and creaking frame reflecting the weariness I felt inside. The open road offered temporary freedom from the suffocating memories of my past, and the promise of uninterrupted solitude was exactly what I craved. But from the moment I left behind the bustle of city life, a subtle, unsettling feeling began to gnaw at me. The RV's electronics malfunctioned sporadically. Lights flickered, and my phone's battery inexplicably drained overnight. One morning, I discovered large muddy footprints circling the vehicle, as if something, or someone, had been watching me in the dark. Carved into the bark of the trees along the roadside were strange symbols, crudely etched and disturbing in their simplicity. I tried to dismiss these signs as the result of nature and my own overactive imagination, but a chill ran down my spine. I arrived at my destination just as the late afternoon sun began to sink, casting long, eerie shadows between the trees. I spent the early evening exploring a nearby trail, hoping the gentle exercise would clear my mind. Instead, I found myself confronted by something far more unsettling. Deep gouges in the forest floor, and more of those bizarre markings on tree trunks hinted at a presence that was anything but benign. I stumbled upon an abandoned cabin hidden among the trees. The structure, though crumbling, exuded a desperate urgency, as if its previous occupants had fled in terror. Scattered outside were the remnants of a hastily abandoned campsite. Broken crockery, torn clothing, and strange symbols smeared in what looked unmistakably like blood. Determined to learn more about the mystery that clung to the woods, I stopped by a small general store in the nearest town the following day. The store was dim and quiet, and the few locals who were there exchanged wary glances as I inquired about the legends of the area. An old hunter, his face weathered by years in the wild, pulled me aside. In a trembling voice, he warned me in hushed tones about the Hungerer. His eyes darted nervously, and he insisted that I leave the forest before nightfall if I valued my life. According to him, the Hungerer was a creature born from unyielding, monstrous hunger. A cursed, emaciated spirit of cannibalism that stalked the woods, leaving a trail of inexplicable terror in its wake. I thanked him, though his words only deepened my unease. I knew the stories were likely exaggerated, but something about his fear was genuine. That night, back at my RV, I tried to focus on writing, hoping to channel my swirling anxiety into creative energy. I sat at my small desk, the sound of my tapping fingers on the keyboard mixing with the ambient noises of the forest. Yet, as the hours passed, an eerie scratching began at the door. At first, I assumed it was an animal, perhaps a stray dog or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. I edged toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered out into the inky darkness. There, illuminated briefly by the pale beam of my flashlight, were large, distorted footprints that led away from the RV into the surrounding woods. Suddenly, the door shuddered violently as though something was trying to force its way in. I grabbed a hunting knife from the RV's modest kitchen and backed away, my mind racing. The door burst open with a resounding crash, and a gaunt, shadowy figure lurched into view. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glinted with an unholy hunger. In the ensuing chaos, I managed to fend off the intruder with the desperate, wild swings of my knife. I sustained a few shallow cuts in the melee, and the door was left splintered. Fear had overtaken my rationality, and I scrambled back into the relative safety of the RV's interior. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The violent intrusion had shattered any illusion of security. With my hands trembling, I gathered what little supplies I had and made my way back to the abandoned cabin I'd found earlier. The cabin, though eerie and dilapidated, offered shelter from the open forest and a chance to hide until I could figure out my next move. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of decay. I found a small table strewn with disturbing remnants of a previous occupant's life, a stack of torn pages from a journal smeared with dried blood, and personal effects that spoke of sudden, violent abandonment. Each piece of evidence painted a grim picture. A traveler who had encountered unspeakable terror, perhaps at the hands of a cannibalistic force. Night after night, I huddled in the musty cabin, my nerves fraying with every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind outside. I began to hear a persistent scraping sound outside, as if something was relentlessly stalking the cabin. My imagination and mounting paranoia made it difficult to discern whether these sounds were real or born from the isolation in my own troubled mind. Then, one stormy morning, I resolved that I had to escape the oppressive dread that had become my prison. I planned to leave at dawn, hoping that the safety of daylight would banish the horrors of the night. But, as soon as I stepped outside, the oppressive atmosphere shattered into chaos. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the dense forest. In that jagged flash, I saw him, the Hungerer. Towering and emaciated, his silhouette was grotesque against the backdrop of the storm. His eyes burned with a primal, insatiable hunger, and his ragged form moved with an unnatural, predatory grace. Panic surged through me as he began to pursue me with relentless intent. I bolted into the tangled forest, every step a struggle against the mud and underbrush. The creature's heavy footfalls echoed behind me, mingling with the cacophony of the storm. My mind raced as I recalled the hunter's warning and the horrifying images that had haunted my dreams. I fumbled in my emergency kit until I found a flare. With shaking fingers, I ignited it and hurled it into the darkness. The sudden burst of light was blinding, and for a few heart-stopping moments the creature hesitated, disoriented by the flare's brilliance. Taking advantage of the opening, I sprinted along a narrow trail I had noticed earlier, a faint, overgrown path that promised a way out of the forest. The rain pounded down, turning the ground into a treacherous morass. and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my pulse into overdrive. I dared a glance back over my shoulder, and in the flickering shadows, I could see the monstrous form of the hungerer pursuing me. Relentless and terrifying, I pushed my aching legs to their limit, desperate to reach the safety of civilization. After what felt like an eternity of frantic running, the trail finally opened up to a small, isolated town bathed in the weak light of dawn. I collapsed on the steps of a deserted building, my body battered, my clothes soaked, and my mind reeling from the terror I had just escaped. The few locals who passed by cast me wary glances, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. They exchanged murmurs about the legend of the hungerer, a tale they never wished to see come to life. Even now, as I write these words in the relative safety of a motel room far from that accursed forest, I can still feel the weight of those harrowing hours pressing down on me. I bear scars, both visible and hidden, and my nights are filled with the relentless echoes of that stormy escape. I wonder, with a lingering dread, if the hungerer is truly a manifestation of ancient, cursed hunger, or merely a twisted figment born of nature's cruelty and my own grief-stricken mind. I share my story as both a confession and a warning. Some places hold darkness so deep that even the strongest among us can be devoured by it. I sought refuge in the forest, expecting solace and inspiration, but instead I found only a relentless nightmare. The forest may heal some wounds, but its shadows hide truths that can forever change the way you see the world. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night grows silent, I swear I can still hear the soft, scraping footsteps of something stalking in the darkness, reminding me that the hunger of the woods is never truly sated. My name is Jake Harper. I'm 38 years old. This happened in the summer of 2023, when my girlfriend Sierra, my old friend Mason, and I decided to escape the suffocating monotony of urban life and document a celebratory RV trip deep into Tishomingo State Park, Mississippi. We had heard the local legends, the eerie whispers of a skinwalker known as the Painted One. And though our initial interest was more about capturing some quirky folklore for our travel vlog, none of us ever imagined how quickly those legends would become all too real. I had spent years in law enforcement, so I prided myself on being practical and level-headed. Sierra, resourceful and fiercely independent, was the rock of our little group, while Mason's cynical humor masked a deep-seated anxiety about the unknown. Then there was Lily Thompson, quiet and mysterious, with an intuitive sensitivity to the spiritual disturbances that none of us fully understood. Our RV, an aging beast with a temperamental engine and a GPS that frequently lost signal in the thick woods, groaned as we wound our way into the heart of Tishomingo. The park's reputation for unexplained disappearances and bizarre happenings clung to the air like mist. The first sign that something wasn't right came that very night. While we set up camp in a clearing bordered by ancient oak trees, I noticed odd, large footprints in the damp earth surrounding our vehicle. They weren't human, too wide, too irregular, and as I knelt to inspect them, I felt an inexplicable chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't long after that our equipment began to betray us. Our communication devices sputtered and failed in the dense forest, leaving us isolated. The RV's engine coughed and stalled intermittently, turning what should have been a leisurely trip into a constant struggle against malfunction and the oppressive isolation of the deep woods. At first, Mason's sarcastic quips helped mask his growing unease. "Great, now, even our RV wants to check out the scenery," he joked. But his eyes told another story. A story of fear that he was trying desperately to hide. The following day, as we trekked a poorly marked trail for a better view of the park, Lily fell silent. Her eyes darted around, as if she could see things the rest of us couldn't. "There's something out here," she murmured, almost to herself, as the rustle of leaves seemed to form voices, a faint, mournful whisper of words we couldn't decipher. Sierra squeezed my hand, and I felt a protective surge. I reassured her, though I, too, felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching our every move. That night, as the sky bled a deep crimson with the blood-orange moon, the real terror began. I awoke to the sound of disembodied voices echoing through the trees, whispers that mimicked the voices of lost loved ones. Mason's voice, distorted yet unmistakable, called out, "Jake, help me." I bolted out of my sleeping quarters, my heart pounding, and found Sierra and Mason huddled together outside the RV. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a terror that transcended the ordinary. Before I could speak, Lily appeared at the edge of the clearing, her face ashen, her eyes reflecting something far too dark and ancient for comfort. "We need to leave," she whispered urgently. "Now!" But as we prepared to pack up, a series of harsh realities began to crash down upon us. We encountered a local man, a supposed acquaintance we had met earlier in a nearby town, who offered to help us navigate the park. His manner was overly friendly, his eyes too calculating, and he insisted on guiding us through a shortcut he claimed was safer. Something about him felt off, but desperate for help in our growing isolation, we accepted. As the dusk fell on our second night, our guide led us deep into the forest along an unfamiliar trail. It wasn't long before the atmosphere grew oppressive, the trees seeming to close in around us. The guide's behavior became erratic, his friendly facade slipping to reveal something sinister beneath. Suddenly, we were ambushed. Masked figures emerged from the dense undergrowth, surrounding us with weapons glinting in the half-light. Before we could react, chaos erupted. I remember the searing pain of a blow to the head, and then darkness. When I came to, I was bound in a dimly lit, grimy cell, inside a hidden compound that reeked of decay and burnt offerings. Sierra was there too, her eyes burning with defiance despite the fear etched on her face. We were roughly dragged into the compound by members of a local cult, cultists who worshipped the Painted One, a skinwalker whose ability to mimic and twist human appearances had been their dark god. It was here that we learned of the guide's betrayal. He wasn't there to help us at all, but to lead us into the cult's trap, his loyalties deeply entangled with their twisted beliefs and even with local criminal elements involved in drug trafficking and human exploitation. The cult wasted no time in subjecting us to a harrowing ordeal. They tormented us both physically and mentally, using brutal methods to try and break our spirits. I remember the agonizing tension of being strapped to a cold metal table, the dull thud of a club, and the whispered incantations that mingled with our cries. Sierra's strength was both her shield and her curse. Even as she fought back, I could see the torment in her eyes. Every lash and every whispered threat was aimed at forcing us into submission, to bend our wills to the cult's dark designs. All the while, Mason had been separated from us. I recalled the sound of his desperate shouts echoing through the compound's corridors, a sound that was abruptly cut off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Panic seized me as I realized that something terrible had happened to him. Perhaps he had been taken deeper into the compound, or worse, sacrificed to the dark deity they revered. In the midst of our suffering, Lily's presence became an unsettling mystery. Earlier that night, as we were tortured and the cult's chants grew louder, Lily had vanished. No one knew where she had gone. Some of the cultists muttered about her being a chosen vessel for the Skinwalker, a sacrificial medium whose fate was sealed by the dark rituals they practiced. The mere thought of her fate churned my stomach with dread. Hours, or maybe days, passed, it was impossible to tell in the haze of torment before I managed to free myself from the restraints. The pain was immense, but a surge of adrenaline and the will to survive propelled me. I knew I had to rescue Sierra and, if possible, find Mason. Creeping through the dim hallways of the compound, I overheard the cultists discussing plans for another ritual, one that involved a final, horrifying sacrifice. I couldn't stand by while my loved ones were consumed by this nightmare. In a moment of desperate resolve, I overpowered a guard in a secluded corridor, using the chaos of the ritual as cover. I managed to find Sierra, who was bruised but unbroken, her eyes filled with a fierce determination that mirrored my own. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, voice trembling but resolute. We fought our way through narrow passages and dark, oppressive rooms, every corner hiding the threat of more cultists or worse, the skinwalker itself lurking just out of sight. Our escape, however, wasn't without its costs. In the struggle, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, Mason, being dragged away by hooded cultists. His muffled screams echoed in the labyrinthine corridors, and I felt an overwhelming mix of guilt and determination. Mason, with all his cynicism and reluctant humor, had been our friend, and now he was lost to this abyss of cruelty and supernatural horror. I managed to free Sierra and escape into the wild undergrowth beyond the compound, my mind fixated on finding a way to rescue Mason. The forest outside was a twisted mirror of the terror inside. Shadows moved with malevolent intent, and every rustle of leaves felt like a whispered threat. Our already failing RV was nowhere in sight, and our only hope was to navigate the dense, treacherous terrain. Every step in that haunted forest was fraught with danger. The trails were poorly marked, and the unrelenting downpour that began without warning turned the earth into a treacherous mire. Sierra and I moved cautiously, always alert to the sounds around us. The supernatural was no longer a distant legend, it was stalking us. The skinwalker, the painted one, made its presence known by mimicking voices we recognized, luring us into traps. I sometimes heard Mason's voice, distorted and pleading, only to be met by the echo of his own doubts. As we pressed on, we encountered more unsettling evidence of the cult's influence. Hidden altars with offerings of rotten meat, crude symbols carved into trees, and the unmistakable stench of burnt incense filled the air. The locals we managed to briefly encounter, men and women with wary eyes and hushed voices, warned us to turn back. They spoke in cryptic tones of debts owed to dark forces and the dangers of meddling in affairs beyond mortal comprehension. One elderly woman with trembling hands even mentioned that some among us were already marked for the sacrifice of the cursed one. Her eyes pleaded with us to leave before it was too late. With each passing hour, the forest grew darker, both in light and in spirit. Sierra and I took refuge in a shallow cave where we attempted to regroup and plan our next move. The adrenaline of our escape had worn off, replaced by a numb dread and a growing realization of how deeply we were entangled in this nightmare. I couldn't help but think about Mason, his fate uncertain and his cries echoing in my memory. We had to go back, even if it meant facing the heart of this terror. In the dead of night, driven by desperate need for redemption and rescue, I set out alone to find Mason. Sierra, still weak from our ordeal, insisted on coming, but I knew the risks of slowing down. I can't lose anyone else, I thought, even as I tried to reassure myself that I'd come back for her once I found Mason. The forest seemed to twist around me, each shadow a potential ambush, each rustle a prelude to violence. I clutched the only weapon I had, a rusted hunting knife, and steeled myself against the encroaching darkness. Navigating by instinct and the faint, half-remembered directions we'd overheard in the compound, I finally reached a clearing where the remnants of a makeshift altar stood. There, amidst broken branches and crude symbols, lay Mason's wallet and a single photograph of our group taken before we left town. A surge of both hope and dread flooded me. Mason had been here. I searched frantically, following fresh tracks that led into an even denser part of the woods. The atmosphere was suffused with an eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant, mournful howl of wind through the trees. Then I heard it, a soft, pained cry echoing from behind a cluster of tangled briars. I rushed toward the sound, my heart pounding, only to find a grim scene. Mason lay crumpled on the forest floor, blood trickling down his temple, his eyes vacant and unresponsive. A group of cultists loomed in the shadows, their dark silhouettes moving with predatory grace. Before I could react, one of them lunged, and everything exploded into a blur of violence and desperate struggle. I fought with everything I had, the rusted knife a poor match against the brutality of my attackers. In that moment, as fists and feet rained down on me, I felt the cold, unnatural presence of the Painted One, watching from just beyond the periphery of the struggle. The Skinwalker's presence twisted the battle into a nightmarish blur of screams and blood. Despite my determination, I was overpowered and knocked unconscious. When I awoke, I was lying at the edge of a shallow creek, my head throbbing. Sierra crouched beside me with tears streaking her face. We had escaped the immediate clutches of the cultists, but at a terrible cost. Mason was gone. His disappearance, his sacrifice, burned in my heart like a searing brand, a reminder that in our desperate quest for survival, betrayal and violence had claimed one of our own. We trudged on through the woods, haunted not only by the relentless supernatural presence, but also by the bitter knowledge of how trust had been shattered. The betrayal of the local guide, the violent ambush, and the cult's merciless cruelty had left us scarred. Sierra and I, bound together by shared agony, made a pact as we moved forward. We would expose this terror, honor Mason's memory by ensuring that the darkness they worshipped would not claim any more lives. Eventually, after days of harrowing travel through a forest that felt more like a living nightmare than nature, we found our way back to the outskirts of Tishomingo State Park. With trembling hands, I reported what had happened to the authorities, but the bureaucratic machinery proved sluggish, and the web of local criminal connections meant that justice would be a long time coming, if ever. Meanwhile, the legends of the Painted One persisted in hushed whispers among the locals, a curse that had now taken root in our lives. I still carry the scars of that summer, both visible and hidden deep within my soul. The memory of Mason's final moments, the betrayal that nearly broke us, and the relentless horror of that cursed trail in Tishomingo are reminders that some legends are all too real, and that sometimes the true horror lies not in the supernatural, but in the depths of human treachery and cruelty. Every time I close my eyes, I see the twisted face of the Skinwalker, hear the cries of the lost, and feel the weight of a promise made in the darkness, a promise that I would never allow that terror to claim another soul. And so, even now, as I try to rebuild my life, the haunting memories of that cursed trail remain with me, a constant reminder of how quickly a moment of escape can descend into a nightmare of betrayal, violence, and the relentless grip of evil. My name is Grace Thompson. I'm 42 years old. This happened in the early autumn of 2022, when I left behind a past filled with regret and heartache to seek solace at an isolated RV park on the outskirts of Vicksburg National Military Park in Mississippi. I had hoped that the solitude and eerie remnants of history in the area would force me to confront the ghosts of my own making. A past mistake that still haunted me every waking moment. I arrived in my old RV, a stubborn relic that had seen better days, its engine sputtering as if protesting the journey ahead. The park itself was a forgotten stretch of land, bordered by overgrown fields and dense woods. In the distance, the abandoned Civil War-era military hospital loomed like a decaying monument, its broken windows and peeling paint a silent testimony to the tragedies it once witnessed. The park was managed by Evelyn Carter, a kindly yet enigmatic woman whose welcoming smile belied the secrets that lay hidden beneath her calm exterior. The first night was a mix of restless sleep and unsettling sounds. The wind whistled through the gnarled branches of ancient oak trees, and I couldn't help but think I heard faint whispers echoing from the direction of the old hospital. My RV's power flickered intermittently, leaving me in darkness for long spells. I scribbled in my journal by the light of a candle, trying to organize my scattered thoughts and the overwhelming memories of what I had lost. It wasn't long before I noticed that the park itself seemed to harbor an unspoken sorrow. Evelyn, during a brief conversation over dinner at the park's small communal area, mentioned in hushed tones that the hospital was rumored to be haunted by a spectral figure known only as the Echo, a restless wraith said to be the lingering soul of a wounded soldier, doomed to wander the halls of the ruined building. Her eyes, though kind, were shadowed with a deep and unspoken pain. I couldn't help but wonder if she, too, had her own regrets. Over the next few days, as I attempted to fix minor mechanical issues with the RV and explore the area, I found myself drawn repeatedly to the derelict hospital. I was plagued by dreams of voices, familiar, mournful whispers that blurred the line between memory and hallucination. In these dreams, I saw faces from my past. A man whose life I had inadvertently shattered with my decisions, whose memory tormented me with every breath I took. I wondered if these voices were just manifestations of my guilt, or if the Echo had somehow latched onto my vulnerability. On a particularly overcast afternoon, while the sky threatened rain, I decided to walk a short distance toward the hospital. The gravel crunching under my boots was the only sound accompanying my racing thoughts. As I neared the building, the temperature seemed to drop abruptly, and an oppressive silence enveloped the area. Inside the hospital's decaying corridors, time appeared to have stopped. Broken glass crunched underfoot and faded medical equipment lay strewn about, their purpose long forgotten. It was in one of these corridors that I first encountered the phenomenon. I paused, heart pounding, as I caught a glimpse of a shifting silhouette in a shattered mirror hanging on the wall. For a moment, I was sure I saw a figure, a soldier with eyes full of sorrow and regret, staring back at me. But when I blinked, the reflection was gone, leaving only my own terrified face staring back. I pressed my trembling hand against the cool glass, feeling as though I was connecting with a long-dead soul. That night, the line between reality and memory blurred dangerously. In my RV, I tried to sleep, but the whispers grew louder, echoing in the dark corners of the vehicle. I could no longer tell if they were the ghost of the wounded soldier or the echoes of my own past mistakes. When I awoke in a cold sweat, I found my journal open on the table, the pages scrawled with frantic handwriting that I did not remember writing. It read like a confession, full of regret and cryptic references to a promise made long ago, a promise that had cost me dearly. Desperate for some semblance of clarity, I sought out Evelyn. I found her in the park office, a modest building that once served as the manager's quarters. Her expression was somber when I asked her about the hospital and the strange occurrences. "The Echo isn't just a ghost, Grace," she said softly, almost as if reading my mind. "It's a mirror of our deepest regrets. The hospital holds memories of those who never found closure, and sometimes those memories find us." I left her words echoing in my mind as I returned to my RV, feeling more isolated than ever. That evening, as a violent storm raged outside, the RV's power finally gave out completely. Forced to seek shelter, I decided to venture back to the hospital, despite every instinct screaming for me to run. The corridors of the hospital seemed to pulse with an unearthly energy as I navigated the labyrinth of broken rooms and corridors. I moved slowly, every creak and groan of the building amplified by the howling wind outside. The oppressive darkness was punctuated only by flashes of lightning that illuminated the horrifying decay of the place. Deep in the heart of the hospital, I found a small room that appeared to have once been a ward. In the center of the room lay a dusty, rusted bed, and on the wall, a series of faded photographs depicted soldiers in uniform, faces that looked eerily similar to the figures in my dreams. I felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to touch one of the photographs, and as my fingers brushed against the cold, brittle paper, I was flooded with a rush of memories. I remembered the night of the accident, the decisions made in haste, and the irreversible consequences that had followed. Tears blurred my vision as I sank to my knees, the weight of guilt crushing me. Suddenly, a whisper slithered through the darkness, a clear, distinct voice that murmured, "Forgive yourself." I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was no one there. The presence of the echo was undeniable now. It seemed to glide through the corridors, its spectral form barely visible in the corner of my eye. Each step I took, I felt its sorrowful gaze, as if it was both a harbinger of doom and a call to confront my own inner demons. The storm outside reached a crescendo, and the building shuddered as if in pain. I could hear the sound of broken glass and distant, anguished cries. It was then that I realized I was not alone. In the dim light, I saw a figure, a man, standing at the edge of the ward. He was tall, his features partially obscured by shadow, yet his eyes held an intensity that pierced through the gloom. "Grace," he said, his voice both familiar and alien. "You must remember." I recoiled in terror and disbelief. This stranger seemed to embody every regret I had ever tried to bury. He began to recount fragments of a long-forgotten past, the night when I had made a choice that led to a devastating loss, a choice that had haunted me ever since. As he spoke, the memories returned in a flood of guilt and sorrow. His words were like daggers, each one carving deeper into my soul. I pleaded for him to stop, to let me find peace, but his voice grew insistent. "You cannot run from what you have done. The echo, this place, they are here to make you face it." Overwhelmed, I collapsed, and the man vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. I lay there, shaking in the cold darkness, listening to the storm outside and the persistent murmur of the echo. It was as if the hospital itself was breathing, each creak and sigh a reminder of the lives lost and the secrets buried within its walls. When dawn finally broke, the storm subsided, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence. I emerged from the hospital a changed woman. I had faced the manifestations of my guilt and the spectral presence of the echo, and while I was not entirely free of my past, I felt a small measure of relief, a glimmer of hope that perhaps I could forgive myself. As I made my way back to the RV park, I encountered the mysterious stranger again. He lingered at the edge of the property, his eyes filled with an unreadable mix of sorrow and knowing. "This place will always hold echoes of regret," he said softly, "but it is up to you to decide whether those echoes define you." With that, he disappeared into the mist. I returned to Evelyn's office and recounted my experiences. Her expression was one of quiet understanding, as if she had seen this transformation before in others who had come to the park seeking redemption. The hospital has a way of unearthing what we try to hide, she said. It forces us to confront our past so that we can move forward. I nodded, knowing that my journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, I felt as if I'd taken a step towards healing. Now, as I sit here writing these words in my journal, my hands still trembling slightly from the intensity of that night, I know that the echo of the hospital will forever be a part of me. Its whispers, once a source of torment, have become a reminder of the importance of facing one's own demons. The RV park may be isolated, and the hospital may be a relic of a painful past, but in the depths of that darkness, I found a path to forgiveness, a path to reclaiming the parts of me that I thought were lost forever. Though I left the park shortly after that night, the lessons I learned in those haunted corridors continue to guide me. I still hear the faint whispers in the quiet moments, a reminder that our regrets echo long after the moment of reckoning. And while I can never fully erase the mistakes of my past, I now understand that forgiveness, both from others and, most importantly, from oneself, is the only way to truly move forward. Every time I glance at my weathered journal or pass a forgotten building that bears the scars of time, I recall that fateful night at the hospital. I remember the storm, the broken glass, the spectral figure who forced me to confront the truths I had long buried. And in those memories, I find a bittersweet solace, a reminder that even in the depths of darkness, there is a fragile light waiting to guide us home. I have since returned to the world beyond the park, my journey of healing ongoing. But I carry with me the echoes of regret and the knowledge that confronting one's past is both painful and necessary. In the silence of my solitude, I continue to write, to remember, and to forgive. And perhaps one day, I will finally be free of the echoes that once defined me. My name is Ethan Davis. I'm 34 years old. This happened in the spring of 2023, when I set out in my aging RV from Jackson, Mississippi, determined to chase down the whispers of a local legend near Clarksdale. As a freelance journalist struggling with a recent personal setback, I craved a story that could reinvigorate my passion and perhaps even help me escape the dark corners of my own past. I'd heard murmurs about a cursed back road, one that wound its way through endless fields of tall, whispering grasses, and led to a place where a banshee-like specter known as the Mourning Woman roamed the nights. After a long drive through dusty highways and overgrown byways, I arrived at a remote RV campsite on the outskirts of Clarksdale. The campsite itself was isolated, bordered by decrepit farmhouses and abandoned service stations, whose faded signs hinted at a troubled history. The air was heavy with heat during the day and turned uncomfortably chilly as dusk fell. It wasn't long before I sensed that this was a place where legends weren't merely the product of overactive imaginations. The first night was unsettling. As I settled into my RV, a clunky, well-worn vehicle that had seen its share of misadventures, the radio crackled with static. In the distance, as twilight deepened, I distinctly heard a long, mournful wail carried by the wind. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the wind over the fields, but deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The following morning, while attempting to jumpstart the RV after an inexplicable engine hiccup, I met Jim Monroe. A rugged, local mechanic with grease-stained hands and a cautious smile, Jim offered to take a look at my stubborn engine. He was friendly and down to earth, and I was grateful for the help. Over a cup of weak coffee at a small roadside diner, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard of the legends about the Mourning Woman. Some say she's the spirit of a woman who met a tragic end on these roads, he explained in a low voice. Her wailin' warns folks of doom. His tone was both matter-of-fact and laced with a guarded caution that made me wonder how much of this was true. Intrigued, I pressed for more details. Jim told me that many locals believed the back road itself, winding, crooked, and shrouded in fog on certain nights, was cursed. People had disappeared, and strange happenings were common along that stretch. I scribbled down notes, my mind already racing with possibilities for my feature story. Jim then offered to drive me to a vantage point near the infamous road, claiming his truck was more reliable than my aging RV. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows grew long, Jim and I drove out along the crooked road. The terrain was desolate, the asphalt cracked and overgrown with wild grasses. A dense fog began to settle in, swirling mysteriously around us. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a faint spectral figure, a woman in a tattered dress, moving slowly along the roadside. When I asked Jim if he'd seen anything, he only shook his head. "Nothing but old stories, Ethan. Don't let your mind run wild," he said, his tone dismissive, though I detected a flicker of unease in his eyes. As night fully enveloped the back road, I parked my RV in a small clearing off the road to set up my camera equipment. The oppressive silence was punctured only by the occasional rustling of the tall grass and the distant sound of something that resembled a wail. I decided to record these sounds, thinking they might be part of the natural landscape. But as I listened, the wailing grew more distinct, a mournful, sorrowful cry that seemed to echo the pain of a lost soul. My rational mind balked at the idea, yet I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that I was not alone. Over the next few days, I devoted every waking hour to investigating the lore of the mourning woman. I interviewed a handful of locals, who were all tight-lipped and wary. Their eyes darkened as they spoke of strange lights, eerie cries, and the bitter curse that had plagued their community for decades. Each story was different, yet all hinted at a malevolent force bound to the back road, a force that could be as human as it was supernatural. Things took a turn for the worse on the third night. I had returned to the RV after a late-night recording session near the road, my mind still reeling from the spectral visions and unsettling sounds. As I sat reviewing the footage on my laptop, the RV's power suddenly flickered and the screen went dark. I tried to restart the system, but the power wouldn't return. Dismissing it as yet another technical hiccup, I decided to head back outside to clear my head. That's when I encountered Jim again. This time, his demeanor was cold, and his eyes held a steely determination that was unlike his earlier friendly self. Before I could ask him what was wrong, a group of shadowy figures emerged from the surrounding darkness. My heart pounded as I realized I was surrounded by locals, their faces hidden in the shadows, their expressions hostile. Jim stepped forward and with an apologetic look explained in a low, urgent tone that I needed to come with him. I was too confused and frightened to protest. One of the men grabbed my arm, and before I knew it, I was being shoved into the back of a nondescript truck. The ride was a blur of terrified shouts and angry murmurs in a dialect I barely understood. They drove along the crooked road at a breakneck speed, the fog swirling around us like a living entity. In the back of the truck, I was bound to a seat with rough rope, my mind reeling with disbelief. Jim sat beside me, his earlier warmth completely replaced by a grim resolve. Once we arrived at a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place that reeked of decay and hidden secrets, Jim explained in a hushed tone that I had dug too deep. The locals, steeped in old superstitions and a fierce desire to protect their traditions, couldn't allow an outsider to expose what they believed must remain hidden. I was accused of stirring up old wounds and threatening the balance between the past and present. The figure of the mourning woman was not just a ghost story to them, it was a warning, a sacred omen meant to protect the community from an unspeakable fate. They left me there, tied up in a grim, abandoned barn, while Jim warned me in a final, measured tone, "You should have listened. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." The hours that followed were a horrifying mix of physical discomfort and psychological torment. I was blindfolded and my hands were bound tightly, and I was subjected to a barrage of questions and threats from a few rough-looking men. Their words were a mix of superstitious fervor and raw anger. They spoke of ancestral pacts, of sacrifices made to appease the spirit of the mourning woman, and of the terrible price that must be paid if the curse were to be broken. In the darkness, my mind raced. I struggled to reconcile the rational part of me with the surreal terror I was experiencing. Was the mourning woman merely a legend, or was she a tangible force that these people truly believed in? Every whispered word, every cry in the night outside, only deepened the horror of my predicament. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to break free from one of the loose ropes and, using a shard of broken glass I found on the barn floor, I cut my bindings. In a moment of desperate determination, I crept through the creaking wooden structure, guided only by the faint light seeping through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The barn doors were unlocked, and I slipped out into the cold, foggy night. I ran along the back road, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, the echoes of my captor's shouts fading into the distance. The fog was thick, and every twist of the crooked road seemed to lead me deeper into uncertainty. I kept thinking of Jim's earlier betrayal, how his friendly facade had crumbled to reveal a man caught between duty and belief. The realization that I had been used as a pawn in this dangerous game of folklore and fear gnawed at me, but I also knew that I had to survive and uncover the truth behind the legend. In the following hours, as I staggered along the overgrown roadside, I couldn't shake the haunting wail that had first drawn me here. The mournful cry of the mourning woman. It seemed to follow me, drifting on the wind, merging with the sound of my pounding heart. At one point, I stopped beneath a crooked oak tree, its twisted branches silhouetted against the fog. There, in the wavering half-light, I saw her. A pale, ghostly figure in a tattered dress, her face shrouded in sorrow, her eyes empty yet pleading. The apparition drifted closer, and for a moment I was paralyzed, caught between terror and a desperate curiosity. Her cry was soft and heartbreaking, a sound that spoke of endless sorrow and loss. In that moment, I felt a strange connection, as though her pain mirrored the regrets I carried within myself. But before I could fully comprehend the significance, the vision dissolved into the mist, leaving me alone with the relentless sound of the wind and my own ragged breaths. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small roadside service station that seemed to be abandoned. The dilapidated building provided a temporary refuge from the oppressive night. Inside, I discovered an old journal tucked away on a dusty shelf. Its pages were filled with entries that detailed the station owner's encounters with the mourning woman, recounting tragic events and eerie warnings that paralleled the legends I'd been investigating. The journal suggested that the spirit was more than just a ghost. It was a manifestation of the collective sorrow and trauma of the local community, a force that had been both revered and feared for generations. As dawn broke, the fog began to lift, and the world slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. I limped back to my RV, battered and exhausted, with a mind swirling with questions and a heart heavy with the weight of what I had experienced. I knew I had survived, but the ordeal had changed me. The legend of the mourning woman was no longer just a story to be written. It was a living, breathing nightmare that I had been forced to confront. In the days that followed, I recounted every detail in my notes, determined to expose the truth behind the legend while grappling with the reality of the betrayal and violence I'd endured. I contacted colleagues and local authorities, but the web of secrecy among the locals proved impenetrable. Jim's betrayal and the chilling actions of his accomplices were shrouded in a cloak of superstition and fear that no rational investigation could easily unravel. Even now, as I sit in a small motel room far from that cursed back road, I can still hear the echoes of that fateful night. The mournful wails drifting on the wind, the soft, sorrowful cry of a spirit whose pain seems to linger long after her time. The experience left me scarred and forever changed. A stark reminder that some secrets are protected at any cost, and that the line between myth and reality is often far more blurred than we dare to imagine. I've since published my story, though I know many will dismiss it as the ramblings of a man who crossed the threshold between reality and nightmare. But I know what I saw, and I know the fear that gripped me as I realized that some legends are not only real, they are deadly. And while I continue to search for answers, the memory of that cursed back road, the betrayal of a man I once trusted, and the haunting cry of the mourning woman serve as a constant reminder that some whispers are best left unspoken. Every night when the wind picks up, I can almost hear her, calling out from the darkness, a lament for a past that refuses to fade away, and a warning to those who dare disturb the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. O3 Mini. My name is Alex. I'm 34. This happened last fall when my friends and I decided to escape our hectic lives for a long weekend in the Mississippi Delta. I had hoped that the isolation of the swampy backwaters would offer clarity and peace, but nothing could have prepared us for what was waiting in the dark. We piled into an old RV, its faded exterior and sputtering engine a constant reminder that we weren't exactly traveling in luxury. I was the one who organized the trip, thinking that reconnecting with nature would help me sort through my own personal demons. Alongside me were Jess, Mark, and Lara, 3 friends I'd known for years. Jess was the adventurous, enigmatic one with a past she never fully revealed. Mark, always ready for a fight, had a temper as big as his biceps. And Lara, the gentle soul whose empathy made her the heart of our group. We were joined, albeit briefly, by Earl, a taciturn local guide who'd offered his help when our RV first faltered near an abandoned cotton mill on the outskirts of the swamp. The problems began almost immediately. Not long after we set off, the RV's engine started coughing and stuttering before finally dying in the middle of a muddy, desolate road. It was as if the machine had given up on life just as we stepped into the forgotten landscape of the Delta. Our cell phones, too, struggled to catch any signal amidst the oppressive canopy of ancient cypress and oak trees. We set up camp near the remnants of that old cotton mill, unaware that its history was steeped in local legends of ritual and sorrow. The first night, I sat by a weakly glowing lantern outside the RV, feeling the chill seep into my bones. I remember noticing strange, crudely carved symbols on a nearby tree, a mix of archaic signs and what looked disturbingly like human faces. I told myself it was the work of vandals, but a nagging unease tugged at me. It wasn't long before Jess began to act even more secretively than usual. She would wander off to the edge of the woods, speaking in hushed tones to herself, and her eyes would dart toward the darkness as if she recognized something none of us could see. On the second night, as the wind howled through the crooked branches, the group's tension came to a head. Mark was ranting about the poor state of our equipment, blaming our misfortune on our poor planning. I tried to calm him, insisting that we needed to stick together, but in the background, Lara's soft, anxious murmurs grew louder as she insisted we should consider leaving. It was then that Earl, who had been silently watching us since dusk, muttered something under his breath about the ones who worship the old ways. His words sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Later that night, while I lay in a sleepless daze on a creaking cot, I heard a distant, eerie chant echoing through the swamp. It was low and rhythmic, almost as if the wind itself were speaking in an ancient tongue. I glanced over to see Jess staring blankly out the RV window, her face illuminated by the moonlight, as if she were entranced by the sound. The following morning, the RV still wouldn't budge. We resolved to seek help, and with Earl's reluctant guidance, we decided to leave the safety of the RV and trek through the swamp toward a small town not far off. The oppressive humidity and thick mud made every step a struggle, and our path was marked by more of those unsettling symbols etched into trees and old, rusted posts. The air grew heavy, and the distant sounds of something, perhaps voices, perhaps something else, echoed through the trees. That's when the nightmare truly began. As we pressed on, Mark's voice rang out in alarm. "Something's following us," he shouted, as he swung wildly at the darkness. I caught a glimpse of a gaunt, twisted figure, its skin mottled, its eyes burning with a feral intensity, disappearing behind a clump of trees. We froze, terror gripping our hearts. Earl whispered that it was the swamp hag, a demonic entity bound to the cult rumored to have once used the cotton mill for unspeakable rites. Our group was divided. Jess's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She seemed to understand the creature far too well, as though she had a connection to it. It wasn't long before her secret emerged in a way none of us could have anticipated. One fog-laden evening, as we huddled together trying to devise a plan to repair the RV or find help, Jess suddenly bolted from the group. I chased after her, heart pounding, only to catch her in a secluded clearing where masked figures emerged from the shadows. I hid behind a fallen log, peeking as Jess knelt before a central figure draped in ragged robes, her eyes vacant. In that horrifying moment, I realized Jess had been involved with the local cult all along. Whether she was coerced by them or had chosen this path was unclear, but the betrayal stung like a lash. Before I could process this revelation, chaos erupted. The cult members, led by the grotesque figure of the swamp hag herself, who now emerged from the mist like a nightmare-given form, launched an ambush on our group. Amid the ensuing melee, Mark, ever the fighter, tried to protect us. His strength and courage shone through for a moment, but then they overpowered him. I heard his desperate screams as he was seized by two masked figures, dragged into the dense underbrush, and subjected to brutal, unspeakable torture. Oh, the sound of his cries echoed through the swamp long after he was taken. In the ensuing pandemonium, I scrambled back to the RV only to find that Lara was gone. The RV's door was left ajar, and her belongings were scattered about as if she had been hastily removed from our midst. My heart pounded with dread and anger, both at the cult and at the betrayal that had fractured our small circle of trust. I tried to rally the remaining members, but fear had taken root. Earl's eyes, now filled with sorrow and warning, indicated that our time was nearly up if we didn't act fast. Desperate, I led what was left of our group deeper into the maze of the swamp, determined to rescue Mark and, if possible, find Lara. Each step was a battle against the murky waters, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present feeling that something malevolent was stalking us from the shadows. The cult's lair turned out to be an old, decrepit structure near the ruins of the cotton mill, a place that reeked of decay and despair. I found myself standing before a rusted gate, its metal twisted and covered in the same strange symbols that had haunted us since our arrival. The air around the entrance was heavy, charged with a dark energy that seemed to whisper threats in a language I couldn't understand. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive. Flickering candles cast distorted shadows on the walls, and the smell of burning incense mixed with something far fouler, decay, and perhaps blood. I crept along the narrow corridors, my every step accompanied by the haunting echoes of distant chanting. It was there, in a grim chamber at the heart of the lair, that I finally glimpsed Mark. Bound to an ancient chair, he bore deep, brutal wounds. His eyes, though filled with pain, still burned with a spark of defiance. Before I could reach him, a figure blocked my path. It was Jess. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions, guilt, resignation, and something far darker. "I'm sorry, Alex," she whispered, the words barely audible over the chorus of torment from another room. They have my family." Her eyes darted around, pleading for understanding. I wanted to hate her for the betrayal, but the truth of her predicament was too painful to ignore. There was no time for reconciliation. The swamp hag materialized again, her ghastly presence commanding the space. With a voice that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building, she ordered me to leave. In that moment, I realized that every choice I made was being manipulated by forces beyond my control. I grabbed Mark, who murmured something about a hidden passage beneath the structure, and we fled into the dark corridors, leaving behind a trail of anguish and chaos. As we navigated the labyrinthine underbelly of the lair, the sound of footsteps and muffled cries grew louder. I could sense that our pursuers were closing in. Every dark corner and creaking floorboard amplified my terror. I knew that if I didn't act fast, we would all fall prey to the cult's malevolence. In a desperate bid, I forced open a hidden door that led to a narrow, dank passageway. The air was thick with the stench of mold and decay, and I fought back the urge to vomit. But there was no turning back now. Mark's condition worsened with every step, his pain a constant reminder of our failure to protect him. In the dim light, I could almost see his resolve waning. I pressed on, driven by a mixture of desperation and hope that I could somehow turn the tide. The passage led us to a small chamber that appeared to be an old storage room. There, I discovered signs that Lara had been held. Her scarf, a delicate piece of fabric, lay crumpled in a corner. The realization hit me hard. Lara was in grave danger. My heart pounded as I pieced together a plan. I knew that if I could signal the local authorities, we might have a chance. But my previous attempts to reach out had been met with indifference, or worse, complicity. The authorities in this region were either too scared or entangled with the cult to help. I realized that the only way to save my friends was to confront the horror head-on, using the very layout of this accursed place to my advantage. Summoning every ounce of courage, I retraced our steps to the main chamber where the cult was gathering. The sounds of their dark rituals, distorted chanting, the scraping of metal on stone, and the anguished cries of the tortured echoed in my ears as I prepared to set a trap. I knew that the swamp hag was the key. Her power was bound to the ancient symbols, and if I could somehow disrupt that connection, I might weaken the cult enough to rescue Lara and free Mark from his torment. In the ensuing confrontation, violence erupted like a storm. I managed to create a diversion by toppling over ancient relics and disrupting the candles that seemed to feed the darkness. In the chaos, cult members scrambled, and I seized the opportunity to confront the swamp hag directly. The creature's eyes burned with a malevolence that chilled my soul. I hurled a makeshift weapon, a heavy iron rod, at her, managing to strike her arm. Her scream was otherworldly, a sound that reverberated through every fiber of my being. It was in that moment, amidst the violent clash, that I heard a familiar voice, Lara's voice. Weak but determined, she emerged from the shadows of a side corridor, her face streaked with tears and grime. My heart soared with a mix of relief and renewed determination. But there was no time for reunion. The cult members, enraged by our interference, attacked with renewed ferocity. I fought desperately to protect Lara and Mark, even as the darkness threatened to consume us. In the frenzy, Jess reappeared. Torn between her previous betrayal and the stark reality of our shared suffering, she fought alongside us with a ferocity that belied her earlier secrecy. As the battle raged, I realized that every life was hanging by a thread. Mark, battered and broken, clung to consciousness as we pressed our advantage. Jess's conflicted loyalties were laid bare in the crucible of violence, and even Earl, who had remained an enigma, joined our desperate struggle. The fight was brutal and merciless. I felt the sting of a blade and tasted blood as I maneuvered through the swirling chaos of violence and supernatural fury. In a final desperate bid, I forced the swamp hag into the center of the ritual circle. There, drawing on every scrap of resolve, I shattered one of the ancient symbols with the iron rod. A surge of energy exploded outward, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to fracture. The cult members, now disoriented, began to falter. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the screams faded into an eerie silence, I took stock. Mark was barely clinging to life, his body a map of scars and wounds that would haunt him forever. Laura, though shaken, managed to stand, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and lingering terror. Jess, her betrayal forgiven in the face of our shared ordeal, offered a broken apology, her voice trembling with remorse. Earl, silent as ever, simply nodded before disappearing into the shadows, leaving us with more questions than answers. We had survived the night, but the cost was high. The Mississippi Delta, with its ancient curses and hidden terrors, had claimed its due. As we limped away from the ruins of that cursed lair, I couldn't help but feel that the darkness was far from vanquished. The memories of that night, the sound of Mark's screams, the swamp hag's haunting wail, and the sorrow in Jess's eyes, would forever linger in my mind like a relentless nightmare. Now, as I sit in a modest motel far from the swamp, nursing both physical and emotional scars, I know that some wounds never truly heal. The Delta had shown me the fragility of trust, the cruelty of betrayal, and the lengths to which one must go to survive in a world where ancient evils and human treachery intertwine. I remain haunted by the faces of those I once trusted, and by the unending question of whether the darkness we encountered was merely a manifestation of our own inner demons, or something far more sinister, lurking in the depths of the world we call home. In the quiet moments before sleep, I still hear the faint echoes of that dreadful night, a reminder that sometimes the past and its horrors are never truly laid to rest. My name is Miles. I'm 47. This happened last spring when I decided to drive my old RV out to the Tombigbee River campgrounds in northeastern Mississippi. I was desperate for solitude, a chance to escape the guilt and regrets that had dogged me since a painful breakup that shattered my life. I hoped that the quiet isolation of the cypress-draped woods and fog-laden nights might help me put my past to rest and spark new inspiration for my writing. I arrived at the campground late in the afternoon. The sun was just beginning to sink behind ancient trees whose sprawling limbs were draped with Spanish moss, and the air carried a heavy, humid promise of summer storms. My RV, already creaking under the strain of countless miles, immediately gave me a hint that this trip might be more challenging than I'd imagined. Its radio sputtered static, and my phone struggled to catch any signal. Still, I shrugged off the ominous signs as quirks of an old machine and set up camp near a narrow stretch of the river. As dusk fell, the atmosphere grew thick with both humidity and an inexplicable melancholy. I sat outside the RV on a rickety chair, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and listened to the distant murmur of the river mingling with the rustling of leaves. It was then that I first heard the soft, sorrowful crying coming from the dense stand of cypress trees. At first, I thought it might be the wind playing tricks on my ears, but the sound was too human, too filled with despair. Warily, I left the RV to investigate. Near an ancient tree with gnarled roots, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. A delicate antique locket, half buried in the mud. Its surface was tarnished by time, and the engraved initials were barely legible. I picked it up, feeling an odd tug in my chest, as if the locket carried a secret longing. Unsure of what to make of it, I tucked it into my pocket and returned to the relative safety of my RV. Later that night, as I tried to fall asleep, despite the persistent drip of rainwater from the eaves, I discovered something even more unsettling. Beneath a loose floorboard in the RV, hidden away as if someone had deliberately stashed it there, lay a tattered journal. Its pages were filled with the scribbled entries of a long-forgotten traveler whose words echoed my own feelings of guilt and loss. One entry mentioned a tragic figure known as the Weeping Widow, a woman doomed by betrayal and heartbreak, destined to wander these very woods. The lines between my own sorrow and the stranger's lamentations blurred, and I felt an almost desperate need to understand what had bound our fates together. The following day was stiflingly hot, and the RV's malfunctioning radio crackled with intermittent, unintelligible voices. I tried to distract myself by exploring the campground, but my thoughts kept returning to the locket and the journal. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of an old branch seemed to whisper fragments of sorrowful secrets. As evening approached again, the temperature dropped, and a dense fog rolled in from the river. I sat on the RV's porch, the journal open on my lap, and began reading aloud softly in hopes of exorcising the memories that had haunted me for so long. The air was thick with anticipation, and the distant sound of weeping, now unmistakably human, grew louder. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the dropping temperature. In the gathering darkness, I saw her for the first time. A pale, spectral figure in a flowing white dress emerged from the fog near the riverbank. Her eyes were filled with endless grief, and her lips trembled as if on the verge of weeping again. I recognized her from the journal entries. The Weeping Widow, a tortured soul condemned by a past steeped in betrayal. I stood frozen, caught between terror and an inexplicable empathy. Her silent, sorrowful gaze seemed to implore me to do something I couldn't yet understand. Over the next few nights, her appearances became more frequent. I began hearing her voice carried on the wind, a soft murmur urging me, almost pleading, to return the locket to the river. Each night, as I lay in the cramped darkness of the RV, the whispers of her sorrow seemed to merge with my own inner torment, dredging up memories I had long tried to suppress. I questioned whether these occurrences were the product of my own fragile state of mind, or if I was indeed encountering something supernatural. Then came the night of the storm. Heavy, relentless rain battered the RV and sent the river into a frenzy. The wind howled as though in agony, and the cypress trees bowed under its might. That night, the RV's power flickered and died entirely, leaving me in a suffocating, pitch-black silence punctuated only by the storm's wrath. I huddled in the cramped space, the journal and locket close at hand, when I heard a new sound. Urgent, animalistic howls from the darkness outside. I peered out the small, grimy window and saw a pack of wild canines circling near the edge of the clearing. Their eyes glinted with feral hunger, and their low growls sent shivers down my spine. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the storm's darkness as I bolted the door. The isolation of the RV, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell against an encroaching nightmare. In the midst of the storm, the weeping intensified. The spectral figure of the Weeping Widow materialized before me once more, her presence more insistent than ever. I knew then that I had to heed her unspoken command. With trembling hands and a heart pounding like a drum in my ears, I gathered my resolve. I wrapped a worn jacket around myself, took the locket from my pocket, and stepped out into the downpour. I trudged through the swirling rain, guided by the faint, sorrowful glow emanating from the river. The path was treacherous. Slippery mud and fallen branches made every step a struggle. The wild canines had dispersed, perhaps deterred by the tempest, but I could still feel their eyes tracking my movement from the shadows. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, yet the ghostly figure in white beckoned me onward. When I reached the riverbank, the water was swollen and furious, surging over its banks in a torrent of chaos. The antique locket seemed to pulse in my hand as I knelt by the edge. I hesitated for a moment, the voice of the weeping widow echoing in the tumultuous wind. Then, with a resolve born of desperation and a need for redemption, I released the locket into the churning water. It slipped from my grasp and vanished beneath the surface, carried away by the current as if returning to a long-lost home. Almost immediately, the storm's fury began to subside, and in the eerie calm that followed, the spectral figure reappeared. She stood before me on the riverbank, her expression softening into one of profound gratitude. For a long moment, we regarded each other in silence, the broken man and the sorrowful ghost, bound together by a shared melancholy and a desire to be freed from the chains of regret. Then, as silently as she had come, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the mist. The heavy weight of guilt and sorrow that had burdened my heart lightened, replaced by a tentative sense of release. I felt as though the act of returning the locket had set something right, not just for the restless spirit, but for me as well. That night, as I made my way back to the RV, the oppressive dread seemed to lift. The wild canines had retreated, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water and the soft rustle of the recovering forest. I sat in the dim light of the RV, rereading the entries in the journal. The final entry, scribbled hurriedly, hinted that forgiveness and letting go were the only paths to redemption, both for the weeping widow and for anyone who dared to confront their own past. In the days that followed, the technical glitches in my RV ceased inexplicably. The radio, once a chaotic symphony of static, now played a steady, almost soothing hum. The oppressive atmosphere of the campground gave way to a tentative peace. I spent long hours writing, pouring the raw emotions of those storm-tossed nights onto paper. I found solace in the act of creation, the merging of memory and myth into something that felt both cathartic and real. Even now, as I sit at my cluttered desk back home, the memory of that solitary journey lingers like a half-remembered dream. The voices of the past, the spectral weeping, and the silent gratitude of the weeping widow have left their mark on my soul. I've come to understand that sometimes the greatest hauntings are not the ones that visit us in the dead of night, but the ones we carry within our hearts. The Tombigbee River campgrounds, with its ancient cypress trees and whispered legends, remains etched in my memory as the place where I confronted my inner demons and found a measure of redemption. I now know that the pain of loss and regret can be both a burden and a catalyst, a force that drives us to seek forgiveness, to make amends, and ultimately to let go. And as the soft, distant echoes of the weeping widow's lament drift through my dreams, I find comfort in knowing that some wounds, once healed, can finally begin to fade into the quiet, healing silence of acceptance. My name is Nina. I'm 29. This happened last fall, when I set out on what I thought would be a routine RV camping trip into the heart of the Mississippi Delta. As an investigative journalist, I was always drawn to unsolved mysteries, and the recent string of cold cases involving missing locals had pulled me deep into the secrets of the Delta National Forest. I needed answers, and perhaps, in the process, a bit of closure for the demons of my own past. My RV, a battered but reliable old rig, rumbled its way into a secluded clearing deep within the forest. Tall, ancient cypress trees loomed overhead, their limbs draped with Spanish moss that swayed like ghostly figures in the wind. The isolation was absolute. My cell phone barely caught a signal, and the radio only managed to spout intermittent static that sounded almost like whispers. I set up camp near a small, overgrown trail, and decided that this solitude would give me the quiet I needed to focus on my investigation. It wasn't long after I settled in that I noticed the RV acting strangely. At odd intervals, the power would cut out, and my essential equipment, my notebook, camera, and voice recorder, seemed to be inexplicably misplaced. I chalked it up to the quirks of an old vehicle in a remote area, though a persistent unease began to gnaw at me. The first true sign that something was amiss came on a particularly dark evening. I was reviewing notes and photographs inside the RV when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible murmur coming from outside, like the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel and whispers that mimicked my own name. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside into the chilly darkness. The beam cut through the fog, revealing nothing but the twisted silhouettes of trees and the faint outline of an abandoned logging camp in the distance. I spent the night on edge. Every rustle, every snap of a twig set my heart pounding. The next morning, while taking a walk to clear my head, I stumbled upon a tattered, leather-bound diary half buried under a bush near the trail. Its cover was worn, and the pages inside were filled with frantic handwriting detailing fear, pursuit, and a slow descent into madness. One entry caught my attention. It spoke of a man being relentlessly stalked by a shadow that haunted his every move, and it ended with a chilling message: "Don't follow the echoes." I tucked the diary into my backpack, determined to analyze its contents later. At a rundown gas station on the edge of the Delta, I met Mr. Harlan, a grizzled, taciturn local with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow. Over a cup of weak coffee, he leaned in close and murmured, "Some things in these woods are best left alone." His gaze shifted uneasily toward the forest. Though I tried to probe for more details, he only repeated his warning with a furtive glance before disappearing back into the dusty anonymity of the small town. That night, back at the RV, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The radio continued to crackle with unexplained static, and my recording device picked up eerie, indistinct sounds that I couldn't explain. Then came the voices, faint at first, then louder. A chorus of disembodied echoes that seemed to call out my name, taunting and chilling me to the core. I sat in the darkness, paralyzed by fear and the oppressive silence that followed each echo. I began to sense that I was not alone. Footprints, fresh and deliberate, circled the RV. The prints were too distinct to be those of an animal, and they led toward a dense copse of trees where the light failed to penetrate. I kept my distance, heart hammering, as I followed the trail with my camera in hand, recording every step. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the diary's words reverberated in my mind. The entries seemed to describe my exact experience: isolation, the relentless echo of footsteps, and the overwhelming sense of being hunted. Then, on a moonless night amid a violent storm, everything came to a head. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain battered the RV, plunging it into darkness as the power finally gave out for good. I was alone, stranded, and utterly exposed to the tempest outside. I could hear the thunder roll overhead, punctuated by the scraping sounds of someone, or something, circling the RV. The distinct sound of deliberate footsteps, paired with the eerie whispers of my name, drove me to the brink of panic. I bolted out of the RV, armed with nothing but my camera and a battered flashlight. I sprinted into the swirling darkness, guided by instinct and a desperate need to confront the unseen threat. My heart raced as I navigated through the treacherous underbrush, every snap of a branch sending shockwaves of terror through my body. I reached an open clearing near an old, decrepit cabin that looked like it hadn't been occupied for decades. There, beneath the cabin's broken window, I found crude symbols scratched into the wood, a message meant for someone to see. Don't follow the echoes. As I stood frozen, trying to piece together the clues, I caught a glimpse of a figure lurking in the shadows. It was a man, a pale, gaunt silhouette whose eyes seemed devoid of humanity. My blood turned to ice as he moved with deliberate, predatory grace. In that moment, I realized that I was being stalked. Every uneasy feeling, every inexplicable sound had been a prelude to this horrifying confrontation. The stalker began leaving taunting messages for me. I found more symbols etched into the bark of trees along the trail leading back to the RV, and even my belongings were disturbed. My notebook opened to pages I didn't remember writing, my camera left in disarray. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the echoes of my own footsteps were not entirely my own. I retreated to the relative safety of my RV, but sleep eluded me. I spent a sleepless night barricaded inside, the small space filled with the persistent echoes of the storm and my own ragged breaths. In the dead of night, I recorded my thoughts, every word trembling with a mix of fear and determination. I vowed to uncover the truth behind the unsolved disappearances and the sinister force that seemed to be targeting those who dared to dig too deeply into the Delta's secrets. The next morning, bruised and exhausted, I emerged from the RV to find that the storm had passed, but the eerie silence remained. I reviewed the footage on my camera, grainy images of dark figures and fleeting shadows that were difficult to decipher. Among the footage, one frame stood out. A clear shot of the stalker's face, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he were daring me to follow him deeper into the darkness. Determined not to let fear paralyze me, I began piecing together the clues. The diary's entries, Mr. Harlan's cryptic warnings, the symbols etched in the woods, all pointed to a long-standing local vendetta, a cover-up that had allowed this predator to roam free for far too long. I recalled Mr. Harlan's haunted eyes as he mentioned the unsolved cases of missing locals, and I realized that the stalker might be linked to those very tragedies. Armed with my camera and the diary, I decided to confront the evidence head-on. I returned to the derelict cabin, determined to search it thoroughly. Inside, the air was thick with decay and the remnants of lives long past. I discovered personal belongings strewn about, a scarf, a photograph, a set of keys, and a wall covered in hastily scrawled notes and newspaper clippings about disappearances. The room reeked of neglect and something far darker, a sense of unresolved horror that permeated every corner. It was there, in that decrepit space, that I finally heard the stalker's voice, a low, menacing whisper that slithered through the shadows. I turned, and in the flickering light of my flashlight, I saw him. The confrontation was swift and brutal. The man lunged at me, his eyes burning with a disturbing intensity. We struggled, and in the chaos I managed to snap a few more clear photos of his face before I broke free and bolted back into the night. My adrenaline surged as I ran, the echoes of my pursuer's footsteps pounding behind me like a relentless drumbeat. I didn't stop until I reached my RV, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. Trembling, I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my camera and the diary as if they were my only lifelines. I knew I had to document every detail, every terrifying encounter, if I ever hoped to expose the truth behind the Delta's dark secrets. By dawn, the local law enforcement had been alerted by my desperate calls when I managed to find a spot with weak cell service. I handed over the footage and the diary, my voice steady but eyes haunted. The authorities promised to look into the matter, though I sensed their reluctance. A silent acknowledgement that the shadows in these woods were not easily dispelled. Even as I waited for any sign of the stalker's capture, I continued my investigation from the safety of my RV. The evidence I had gathered painted a grim picture. A man driven by a twisted vendetta, using the isolation of the Delta as his hunting ground. The diary's final entry, scrawled in a trembling hand, hinted that those who pursued the echoes of the past often became echoes themselves, lost, forgotten, and consumed by the darkness. I eventually left the Delta with my body bruised and my mind scarred, but with the conviction that I had unearthed a dangerous truth. The footage, the diary, and my own harrowing experiences became the cornerstone of an investigative piece that would expose the sinister underbelly of the Mississippi Delta. I knew that I might never fully escape the echoes of that night. The relentless whisper of footsteps, the haunting images of a man who lurked in the darkness. But I also knew that by sharing my story, I could shine a light on the hidden horrors that festered in the shadows. Now, as I write these words from the relative safety of my city apartment, I still feel the Delta's grip on my soul. Every creak in the night, every gust of wind, carries with it the faint echo of my name and the cold stare of a predator who once prowled the darkness. I remain haunted by the memory of that relentless pursuit and the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones that hide in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to seek them out. 3 Mini. My name is Harper Williams. I am 35 years old. This happened last fall, during what was meant to be an unforgettable weekend escape along the Natchez Trace Parkway in Mississippi, a journey that turned into a waking nightmare. We'd piled into our old RV with high hopes and too many expectations. Our little group consisted of 4 friends: Liam, the charismatic and seemingly confident leader; Caleb, whose nervous energy often masked a sharp intellect and deep knowledge of local lore; Brianna, whose fearless, impulsive spirit meant she'd never back down from an adventure; and me, the one who always tried to keep everyone's feet on the ground. I had volunteered to document our journey, convinced that a little retreat from the daily grind would reinvigorate our lives. What I didn't expect was that the backroads of Mississippi harbored a darkness that had been waiting for us. Our RV, a clunky relic of better days, sputtered to life with a series of coughs and groans. Almost immediately, we ran into trouble. The GPS unit blinked erratically, as if possessed by a mind of its own, and our cell service was virtually non-existent once we veered off the beaten path. By the time we reached a remote rest stop, the engine had begun acting up, leaving us stranded with nothing but our combined hopes and a growing sense of dread. On our first hike away from the RV, we meandered along a narrow trail fringed by ancient trees. I noticed carvings on the bark, odd symbols that none of us could decipher. Then came the footprints, deep, irregular impressions in the muddy ground, far too large and erratic to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. Caleb, his voice quivering slightly, mentioned a local legend about a skinwalker known as the Red Stalker, a creature said to be a twisted amalgam of man and beast, with eyes that burned like embers. Liam waved off his concerns with a laugh, insisting that such stories were nothing more than folklore to scare tourists. That night, as we set up camp beside the RV, the forest itself seemed to come alive. The wind whispered through the trees in a language that chilled the bone, and distant, guttural murmurs rose from the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. While the others dismissed my concerns as mere nerves, I kept one eye on the dark silhouette of the woods, wondering if something was out there. The tension between us began to fray the edges of our camaraderie. Caleb's persistent warnings and anxious glances clashed with Liam's cavalier attitude. Brianna, always the first to plunge into danger, insisted on exploring further into the forest despite our better judgment. I tried to hold the group together, but it felt as though the very air was splitting us apart. The turning point came on our second night. We decided to leave the RV in search of help for its persistent engine issues, hoping to find a nearby service station or at least a friendly local. We hadn't gone far when a group of men emerged from the shadows, rough-looking individuals whose eyes held a predatory gleam. Their leader sneered, and before we could react, a violent ambush ensued. In the chaos, shouts filled the humid air. I remember the sickening impact of fists and boots against flesh. Liam, who had always exuded an air of control, suddenly began giving orders, but something in his tone felt off, as if he were not entirely on our side. Amid the struggle, I caught a glimpse of Liam exchanging a whispered word with one of the attackers. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. Could it be that the man we trusted was complicit with these dangerous local drug dealers, who we later learned had ties to a clandestine cult operating in these parts? In the melee, Brianna, ever impulsive, tried to take on one of the assailants by herself. In the ensuing confusion, she was overpowered and dragged away into the darkness. Her screams echoed in my ears long after the attackers vanished, leaving us bloodied, frightened, and alone. We huddled near the RV, the cool night air turning bitter as reality set in. Liam's betrayal was now undeniable, and the group's fragile trust had splintered completely. After the assault, Caleb and I were left reeling. Our RV, already a symbol of our failed escape, now sat abandoned and unreliable. With no way to call for help and the local authorities either oblivious or too intimidated to intervene, we made a pact. We would go after Brianna ourselves. The thought of leaving her to the cult's cruel devices was unbearable. We set off into the oppressive darkness, following a trail of clues. A dropped scarf here, disturbed earth there, and whispered accounts from frightened locals we managed to encounter. Each step deeper into the forest felt like stepping into another realm, a place where ancient evil and modern depravity intersected. As we walked, the forest grew unnervingly silent, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. Our search eventually led us to a decrepit compound hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by crude symbols matching those on the trees. From a distance, we could see dim light flickering behind barred windows, and the sound of muffled voices reached our ears. There was no turning back now. We approached cautiously. I remember pressing myself against a cold, damp wall, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened to the agonized cries of what I feared was Brianna. The compound's yard was guarded by several men, their expressions blank and their eyes vacant, as if under the sway of some unholy command. We needed a plan, and fast. It was then that we encountered the creature, a shifting, nightmarish figure that emerged from the shadows like a living nightmare. The red stalker was real. Its body seemed to contort in and out of human shape, the visage of a man meshed grotesquely with the wild features of a beast. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire, and the air around it pulsed with malevolence. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze as I stared into those burning eyes, realizing that this creature was not merely a figment of local legend, but a tangible force of terror that the cult worshipped. The cult members began chanting in a language that made my skin crawl, and I could see that the Red Stalker's presence seemed to empower them. In that horrific moment, everything came crashing together. The malfunctioning equipment, The betrayal, the ambush, and now the supernatural horror standing before us. Our only recourse was to fight. Caleb and I launched a desperate assault. The compound erupted in violence as we overpowered a guard and stormed through a side door. The chaos that ensued was a blur of screams, clashing bodies, and the unrelenting howl of the red stalker as it prowled the perimeter. I found myself in a nightmarish battle with not only human savagery, but with a creature whose very existence defied logic. In the melee, I finally confronted Liam. His eyes, once filled with the promise of leadership, now burned with an unnatural intensity. He admitted in a guttural whisper that he had been in league with the cult from the start, drawn in by promises of power and the allure of the dark arts that the Red Stalker represented. His betrayal was the final nail in the coffin of our friendship. In the ensuing struggle, the confrontation turned brutal. As the creature howled and the cultists closed in, Liam was fatally wounded, a casualty of his own treachery and perhaps a sacrificial offering to the malevolent force they all worshipped. With Liam's death, the cult's focus shifted entirely to us. We pushed forward, desperate to reach the cell where we believed Brianna was held. I could hear her muffled cries through the cold, damp walls, a sound that fueled my determination even as my body trembled with exhaustion and fear. Caleb, bleeding and reeling from his injuries, urged me to turn back, but I refused. I couldn't. Brianna's life was on the line. We finally broke into a dim cell lit by a single flickering bulb. There, chained to the wall, was Brianna, her eyes wide with terror, her body battered from hours of torture. As soon as she saw us, she mustered a weak smile, a silent plea for rescue. With trembling hands, we freed her, but our escape was far from over. The compound erupted into a final, chaotic battle. The Red Stalker roamed the halls, its presence an ever-present reminder of the dark power that permeated every corner of that accursed place. Caleb and I fought side by side, our only thought the safety of our friend. I remember the taste of copper in my mouth, the echo of Brianna's cries mingling with the roar of the creature, and the oppressive weight of betrayal that had brought us here. In the end, the escape was a narrow one. Caleb was left severely injured, his once bright eyes now clouded with pain and exhaustion. I cradled Brianna as we stumbled out into the moonlit woods, leaving behind the compound, the cult, and the unspeakable horror of the Red Stalker. The forest seemed to close in behind us, swallowing the nightmare whole, leaving only the echo of our footsteps and the distant, mournful howls of a creature that had forever scarred our souls. Now, as I sit in a hospital room far from that cursed woodland, I can still feel the chill of that night. The betrayal of a friend, the brutality of human savagery, and the relentless, unholy presence of a supernatural horror have left wounds that will never fully heal. Caleb remains in recovery, a constant reminder of the night we faced both mortal and otherworldly evils. Brianna, though physically scarred, has become a symbol of survival, a living testament to the indomitable human spirit even in the face of the darkest nightmares. I wonder sometimes if the Red Stalker still roams those backwoods, if the cult still whispers its unholy chants under the cloak of darkness, or if all that remains is the shattered memory of what we endured. What I do know is that nothing will ever be the same. The isolation we once sought has become a prison of our memories, a relentless reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors come not from the unknown, but from the betrayal and cruelty within ourselves. And as I write these words, I can still hear the distant echo of those guttural murmurs, a reminder that the shadows of the Natchez Trace Parkway hold secrets that no one should ever dare to uncover. My name is Jonathan Turner. I am 42. This happened last spring when I decided to escape my past and seek solace in the desolate embrace of Mississippi's Blackwater Swamp. After my divorce and the loss of someone dear, I believed that solitude would help me find some peace and perhaps a way to forgive myself. I parked my battered RV on a lonely campsite on the swamp's edge near Natchez, a place where mist hung heavy over murky waters and the silence was punctuated by distant, eerie calls. The RV was nothing to write home about. Its generator coughed to life with intermittent sparks, and the lights flickered as if unsure whether to exist at all. I spent the first evening trying to fix a loose connection in the wiring while my thoughts drifted to the past. The stillness of the swamp felt almost therapeutic, but as night fell, a strange melody began to haunt my ears. A soft, almost hypnotic humming coming from the heart of the wetlands. I assumed it was just the wind playing tricks with the tangled trees, but a creeping unease settled over me. That first night, as I sat on the creaking deck of my RV with a battered journal in hand, I noticed waterlogged footprints near the edge of the camp. They were irregular and too large to be made by any animal I recognized. In the heavy mist, I thought I saw a pale figure. A woman in a tattered, ghostly dress drifting along the watery border. My heart pounded, and despite my rational nature, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The following morning, while trudging through the thick, humid air toward a dilapidated general store for supplies, I encountered an old man named Elijah. His skin was weathered by decades of harsh sun, and his eyes held secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. In a gruff, almost warning tone, he told me, "Don't go listening to that song, son. The bayou siren's call is a lure for the lost." I dismissed it as the ramblings of a local with too much time on his hands. Yet his words echoed in my mind as I returned to my RV. Days passed with my efforts to repair the RV proving fruitless. Missing parts and a stubborn old manual left me increasingly isolated. The power outages became more frequent, plunging me into darkness at the most inopportune moments. Each night, that soft humming grew louder and more insistent. I began to suffer disorienting dreams where the bayou siren appeared, beckoning me toward the swamp's dark heart with eyes that promised both salvation and doom. My thoughts turned inward. I struggled with a deep-seated guilt and grief that had haunted me since my divorce. A guilt that perhaps I deserved the loneliness I now faced. Every rustle of the reeds and every ripple in the stagnant water made me question if the siren was a figment of my tortured mind or something far more sinister. One foggy evening, driven by a mixture of despair and a desperate need to reclaim control, I decided to explore the swamp in search of a solution to fix my failing RV. Armed with a flashlight and my tattered journal, I navigated the labyrinthine waterways and unstable, moss-covered ground. The further I went, the more surreal the environment became. The trees seemed to bend inward, as if whispering secrets, and the very air was thick with anticipation. Then, in a clearing illuminated by a pallid moon, I saw her. The bayou siren. There was no mistaking her ethereal beauty and haunting presence. She was a spectral figure draped in translucent fabrics that floated around her like living shadows. Her eyes, deep and luminous, locked onto mine. In that moment, the humming swelled into a chorus of sorrow and longing, and I felt as if every regret I had ever harbored was being mirrored in her gaze. For a long, agonizing moment, we simply stared at each other. My logical mind screamed that this was impossible, that it was merely a trick of the light and my own fractured emotions. Yet the siren's presence was undeniable, a magnetic force that both terrified and beckoned me. I took a step forward, compelled by a mix of desperation and an inexplicable need for redemption. As I did, her gaze softened, and for a fleeting second I thought I saw an invitation to let go of my past. That invitation was shattered by a sudden rustling behind me. I spun around to find Elijah standing in the shadows, his face unreadable. "Don't listen to her, son," he said quietly. "She's taken many before you." His tone was laced with a cold certainty that sent shivers down my spine. I demanded to know what he meant. But before I could press further, Elijah's eyes darted away, and he muttered something indecipherable about old debts and darker bargains. In the days that followed, my grip on reality began to loosen. My attempts to repair the RV became a struggle against the relentless encroachment of the swamp and the haunting melody that pervaded the night. The siren's voice seeped into my dreams, blurring the lines between hope and despair. I found myself drawn deeper into the marsh, each step taking me further from the man I once was. One evening, as a storm gathered overhead, I followed the unmistakable call of the bayou siren. The wind howled through the cypress trees, and the rain began to fall in heavy sheets, turning the ground to treacherous mud. I waded through ankle-deep water until I reached a clearing where the siren's song seemed almost tangible. There, in the center of a circle of ancient cypress trees, she waited. Under the torrential rain, she spoke, not with words, but with a sound that resonated directly within my soul. I felt both the allure of an escape from my grief and the crushing weight of my past mistakes. In that liminal space between torment and tranquility, I realized that the bayou siren was not simply a ghost of the swamp, but a manifestation of my own inner turmoil. I reached out as if to grasp a hand of salvation, but before I could, Elijah appeared once more, his presence more menacing than before. His eyes, dark and glinting with a mysterious malice, betrayed his true nature. In a moment of bitter clarity, I understood that Elijah had not come to warn me out of concern. He had been orchestrating events all along. His cryptic warnings, his timely appearances, they were all part of a bargain he had made with the swamp's dark forces. He had been feeding my isolation, amplifying the siren's hold on me, all to keep me tethered to this forsaken place. Enraged and feeling utterly betrayed, I turned on him. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling between fury and despair. Elijah only smiled a grim, knowing smile and whispered, "Sometimes, the only way to find redemption is to confront the darkness head-on." With that, he melted back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the siren and the storm. The ensuing moments were a blur of chaos and emotion. Torn between the siren's hypnotic call and my own need to break free of the chains of guilt and regret, I fought to regain control of my mind and body. I struggled against the pull of the water and the seductive promise of oblivion that the siren represented. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet something deep inside urged me to face the darkness. In that final, heart-pounding confrontation beneath the lashing rain and amidst the ancient trees, I made a choice. I refused to surrender to despair. Summoning every shred of willpower I had left, I stepped back from the edge of the clearing and began the long, arduous trek back through the swamp. I ignored the siren's mournful calls and clinging whispers, focusing instead on the sound of my own heartbeat and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. The journey back was grueling. The ground seemed intent on swallowing me whole, and the oppressive darkness pressed in from all sides. My RV, with its unreliable engine and flickering lights, sat like a forlorn beacon of my failed attempts to escape. Yet, each labored step was a testament to my determination to reclaim my life, even as the swamp and its spectral inhabitant sought to pull me under. I finally reached the RV at dawn, drenched, exhausted, and battered by both nature and inner demons. With trembling hands, I managed to start the engine and drive away from that cursed place. the haunting melody of the bayou siren fading into the distance. Even as I left, though, I could still feel her presence lingering in the back of my mind, a reminder that the darkness I fought against was not confined solely to the swamp, but resided within me as well. Now, as I write these words from the relative safety of a small motel far from Blackwater Swamp, I can't help but wonder if I truly escaped its grasp or merely outran the physical boundaries of that cursed land. The scars I bear, both visible and hidden, are constant reminders of the choices I made and the inner demons I had to confront. The betrayal of Elijah, the spectral allure of the bayou siren, and the relentless, oppressive atmosphere of the swamp have forever altered my view of the world. I drive slowly along the highway, the memory of the swamp receding in my rearview mirror. Yet I know that part of me remains there, forever entwined with the darkness I once sought to escape. The bayou siren's song may have faded, but its echo lingers, a haunting reminder that sometimes in the pursuit of redemption, one must face the shadows within. My name is Alexander Monroe. I am 50. This happened one humid autumn when I decided to escape the crushing weight of my past and seek refuge in the deep recesses of Mississippi's DeSoto National Forest. I was a former detective, and the ghosts of a case that went disastrously wrong, one that led to the wrongful death of an innocent, had plagued me for years. I hoped that solitude, away from the relentless reminders of my failures, might grant me some measure of redemption. I drove my aging RV off the main road, its engine sputtering and its generator coughing to life as I finally found a remote campsite tucked away among towering pines and gnarled oaks. The RV's flickering lights cast long, uneven shadows over the damp ground, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness held secrets of its own. The isolation was complete. No cell service, no friendly voices, just the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a night bird. The first evening, as I settled in and tried to repair a loose connection in the RV's wiring, I began noticing small, inexplicable details. Footprints, too deliberate to be those of an animal, circled my campsite. I found crude, handwritten notes tucked beneath the RV's window, their scrawled letters and primitive symbols unsettlingly specific. One note mentioned details of a case I had long buried, details only someone who knew my history could reference. At first, I dismissed it as a cruel prank by a local drifter, but the symbols etched into nearby trees told me otherwise. Night after night, the forest around me stirred with eerie sounds. I heard rustling in the undergrowth, as if someone, or something, was circling my small domain. In the weak beam of my failing security camera, I caught fleeting images of a shadowy figure lurking at the tree line. And then, more disturbing still, personal mementos began to appear. I discovered an old police badge, tarnished and unfamiliar, near the edge of my camp. A faded photograph of my former team, taken during happier times, lay on a rock, as if deliberately left for me to find. I tried to use my outdated equipment to set up a makeshift surveillance system, but every attempt was thwarted by technical glitches. The generator's sputters and the RV's unreliable power only deepened my vulnerability. With every unexplained footprint, every eerie note, and every relic from my past mysteriously appearing at my doorstep, a cold dread settled over me. It was as if my own history had come alive, intent on tormenting me in the very place I had sought to escape it. Unable to ignore the mounting signs, I decided to leave the relative safety of my RV. I ventured into the forest, guided by a desperate need to understand who was orchestrating this campaign of psychological terror. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the forest became. The silence was broken only by my cautious footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. After hours of wandering, I stumbled upon an abandoned cabin hidden beneath a tangle of vines and creeping moss. Its dilapidated exterior and broken windows spoke of decades of neglect, yet something about it compelled me to enter. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint odor of decay. I scoured the room and discovered a collection of old audio recordings and documents strewn across a rickety table. As I listened to the distorted voices on the recordings, a chilling revelation unfolded. The voices were of former colleagues, and one name, in particular, stood out. Detective Ramsey, a man I had once trusted, a partner who had vanished after the case that haunted me. The recordings revealed that Ramsey had not simply disappeared. He had been planning this all along. Consumed by bitterness over the fallout of our case, he had orchestrated a meticulous campaign to torment me, using the isolation of the forest and my own guilt as weapons. My mind reeled. How could someone I had once counted on harbor such venom? Every detail in the recordings, the way Ramsey's voice had measured my mistakes, his cold recounting of every misstep, was designed to remind me that I could never outrun my past. As I absorbed this revelation, a chill seeped into my bones. The forest, once a refuge, had become a trap set by a ghost from my past. That night, as I made my way back to the RV, a storm began to brew. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and the wind picked up with a menacing howl. I barely had time to secure my few belongings when a group of masked figures emerged from the swirling mists. In the deluge of rain, their forms were almost spectral, blending with the darkness as they closed in on me. I fought back with every ounce of strength, but I was outnumbered, and their intentions were clear. They meant to break me. Before I knew it, I was overpowered and dragged from the relative safety of my RV. They bound my hands and blindfolded me, their rough voices indistinct over the pounding rain. The sound of heavy footsteps and muffled curses filled the air as I was led deep into the forest. My heart pounded in terror, and every instinct screamed for escape, but I was helpless. I was eventually brought to a secluded clearing, illuminated only by the sporadic flashes of lightning. In the center of the clearing, a crude makeshift table awaited me. Stripped of dignity and left to face my tormentors, I was forced into a merciless interrogation. They hurled accusations and dredged up every mistake from the past, each word designed to shatter whatever remnants of self-worth I had left. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was the psychological torment, the relentless reminders of my guilt, that cut deepest. In the midst of my suffering, I caught a glimpse of one of the masked men speaking softly into a two-way radio. His voice was laced with malice, and his words confirmed my worst fears. Detective Ramsey had returned, and this was his method of delivering retribution. Every new detail, each act of cruelty, was a reminder of how I had failed, of the price I had paid for my past mistakes. The storm raged around us, the wind and rain blending with my cries and the taunts of my captors. I felt the cold, unyielding grip of despair closing in, threatening to smother me as surely as the darkness of the forest. Yet, somewhere deep within, a spark of defiance flickered. I had spent years running from the ghosts of my past. Now, as I lay battered and broken, I realized that running would only ever bring me back to this moment. I needed to confront the darkness, both outside and within. Summoning every ounce of my training and willpower, I waited for the right moment. Amid the chaos of the storm and the shouts of my tormentors, I managed to loosen one of my bindings. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I attacked my captor, using a broken piece of wood as a weapon. The element of surprise worked in my favor, and in the ensuing melee, I broke free from my restraints. Disoriented but determined, I plunged into the forest, guided only by the cacophony of the storm and the distant sound of pursuing footsteps. Every step was a battle against exhaustion and pain. The forest seemed to twist and contort around me, its undergrowth eager to trap a man who no longer belonged to its world. I could hear the shouts of my pursuers behind me, their figures merging with the darkness. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to escape the clutches of my past and the immediate danger that hunted me. The rain washed away much of the blood and grime as I navigated the treacherous terrain, until finally I saw the faint glow of my RV's lights breaking through the darkness. With one final burst of energy, I stumbled back to the only semblance of refuge I had in this forsaken place. Inside the RV, my body trembled from pain, and my mind raced with the harrowing memories of that night. I managed to start the engine despite the storm's fury and drove away from the forest, the silhouettes of twisted trees and malevolent figures receding in the rearview mirror. Now, I write these words from the sterile quiet of a small motel far from DeSoto National Forest, my body scarred and my soul forever altered. The ordeal has left me with a heavy burden of guilt and regret that no amount of solitude can erase. I know that Detective Ramsey's vendetta, though physically escaped, will forever linger in the shadows of my mind. The bitter taste of betrayal, the visceral pain of retribution, and the unyielding presence of my past are memories I can neither forget nor outrun. As I drive along a desolate highway, the rain finally easing into a mournful drizzle, I can't help but wonder if I truly left the darkness behind, or if it clings to me like an inescapable curse. The forest taught me that some shadows never fade, they simply change shape, always waiting for the moment when we are most vulnerable. And in the quiet moments between the ticking of the clock, I sometimes swear I hear the distant echo of a voice, of a man I once trusted, now forever lost in the twisted corridors of his own making. I will never be the same. The isolation I sought as a refuge became the stage for my ultimate reckoning, a confrontation with the past that I can neither hide from nor forget. And as I continue down this long, uncertain road, I carry with me the painful reminder that redemption is not found in escape, but in facing the darkness within. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 38 years old, and this is how our weekend turned into a nightmare in the backwoods of Mississippi. It all began when my friends and I, Jordan, Casey, Mia, and Dylan, set out in an old, battered RV for what we thought would be an adventurous escape near Cypress Grove Swamp off the Natchez Trace Parkway. I'd always been the practical one, having served in the military, so naturally, I assumed the role of leader. But nothing could have prepared me for the terror that awaited us. We left the city with high spirits and a truckload of enthusiasm. Jordan, ever the adventurer, couldn't stop grinning as he recounted legends about the Swamp Hag, a local tale of a sinister spirit said to haunt the marshes and prey on lost souls. Casey, who'd spent years studying local folklore, warned us to be cautious, her eyes betraying anxiety at every mention of the hag. Mia, with her gentle, compassionate nature, tried to soothe everyone with her calm demeanor, and Dylan, quiet and mysterious, offered cryptic remarks about the history of the region that sent shivers down my spine. Our RV was nothing to write home about, a relic that had seen better days. It coughed and sputtered almost immediately after we hit the back roads, and by the time we arrived near Cypress Grove, its engine was failing us. Despite our best attempts at repairs, it became clear that our mobile sanctuary was as unreliable as our plans were grand. The tension in the cramped interior was palpable as we trudged on foot into the wild, murky depths of the swamp area. That first evening, as dusk swallowed the landscape, the oppressive silence was broken by odd, barely audible whispers carried on the wind. I remember stepping outside, flashlight trembling in my grip, and noticing how the tall cypress trees seemed to lean in as if listening. In the fading light, we found crude symbols carved into the trunks of ancient trees. They mirrored the descriptions in Casey's books, a language of sacrifice and dark rituals dedicated to the swamp hag. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed aside my unease, telling myself that we were merely exploring the unknown. We set up camp in a small clearing, not far from the swamp's edge. The air was heavy, humid, and filled with the scent of decaying vegetation. As night deepened, the unsettling sounds grew: rustling leaves, low murmurs, and the distant, mournful cries that seemed to echo from within the swamp itself. The atmosphere was thick with foreboding, and it wasn't long before our internal conflict surfaced. Dylan, with a grave tone, recounted his own disturbing encounters with local cultists who revered the hag. Jordan laughed it off at first, claiming such tales were overblown, but even his laughter couldn't mask a trace of worry. Casey's eyes darted nervously between the darkened trees, and Mia's soft reassurances did little to dispel the growing dread. Things took a turn for the worse when our already unreliable RV finally gave out completely. With no way to retreat back to civilization, we were forced to move on foot, guided by the dim beams of our flashlights. It was during this long, exhausting trek that the real horror began to manifest. As we ventured deeper into the swamp, the whispers grew louder, and shadows seemed to twist and writhe with a life of their own. In one particularly harrowing moment, I caught a glimpse of a gaunt figure disappearing behind a cluster of trees. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, and my instincts screamed that something was very, very wrong. Then came the ambush. Out of the dense underbrush, a group of masked figures emerged, brandishing crude weapons and shouting in a guttural, unknown language. My heart pounded as I realized that these were no ordinary bandits. They were part of a local cult. The cult, I soon learned, was not only involved in human trafficking and drug dealing, but also worshipped the legendary swamp hag, offering sacrifices to appease the malevolent force they believed dwelled within the swamp. In the chaos that ensued, our group was torn apart. I fought desperately to hold our formation together, but the cultists were ruthless. Before I could react, Mia was grabbed from behind, her screams piercing the humid night. I watched, helpless, as she was dragged away, her pleas for mercy swallowed by the cacophony of shouts and the pounding of boots on damp earth. Even as adrenaline surged through me, I could feel an ominous premonition. This was just the beginning of a horror beyond any of our nightmares. We regrouped behind a fallen log, breathless and terrified. Casey's voice trembled as she described the grotesque symbols she'd seen on the cultists' crude totems, a macabre mirror of the ones we'd found on the trees. It was then that Jordan, who had been unusually silent, let slip that he had known some of these people. His confession, delivered in a hushed tone, cut through us like a knife. He admitted that he'd been approached before the trip by someone connected to the cult, and when pressed for details, he only offered vague promises that he'd handle it. The betrayal stung like a physical blow. Our trust in him shattered as swiftly as the illusions of our weekend retreat. Determined to rescue Mia, I rallied Casey and Dylan. We could not stand idly by while our friend suffered at the hands of these fanatics. With little more than our flashlights and a burning need for retribution, we set off toward the direction we believed the kidnappers had taken her, a decrepit shack hidden deep within the labyrinthine swamp. The path was treacherous. Every step was a battle against sinking mud, overgrown vines, and the ever-present menace of unseen eyes lurking in the darkness. As we navigated the swamp's labyrinth, Dylan's voice, usually quiet and measured, grew more urgent as he recounted his past encounters with the cult. His eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and resolve, hinted at secrets he had long kept hidden. He explained that the cult's rituals were intended to merge the human world with something far darker. A malevolent presence he believed was embodied by the swamp hag. His revelations only deepened our resolve, though they also fanned the flames of mistrust among us. We eventually reached the shack, its decaying facade barely visible in the half-light of dawn. The air around it was thick with the stench of decay and ritualistic fires. I could hear muffled cries from within, a torment that spurred us on despite the overwhelming danger. We burst through the door in a desperate bid to save Mia, only to be met with a scene of horror. Cultists, their eyes glazed with fanaticism, surrounded her as she was bound and beaten. The sight nearly broke me, but anger and desperation lent strength to my arms. A brutal melee erupted. I fought with a mixture of military precision and raw, unrefined rage, determined to free Mia at any cost. Casey, though frightened, managed to deliver swift strikes against any cultist who came near, her survival instincts overriding her anxiety. Dylan's insights proved invaluable as he navigated the chaotic scene, directing our actions with a calm that belied his inner turmoil. Amid the struggle, I caught a glimpse of Jordan lurking in the shadows. His face contorted in fear and regret. His betrayal was laid bare, and though I felt a deep sense of loss, there was no time for recriminations. In the fray, one of the cultists turned on Casey, catching her off guard. A sickening crack echoed in the dim light as she was struck down, her scream echoing in the confined space of the shack. I fought harder, fueled by the desperate need to save Mia and avenge our fallen friend. Eventually, we managed to subdue the remaining cultists, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Mia, though rescued, lay trembling and broken, her eyes haunted by the horrors she'd witnessed. As we fled the shack in the chaos of retreat, I felt a searing pain in my side, a reminder that in the swamp, every step was a dance with death. By the time we made it back to the edge of the swamp, the first hints of dawn were breaking through the oppressive darkness. The cost of our escape was evident. Casey was missing, her absence a gaping wound in our battered group. Later, we learned that she'd been captured during our escape and was found days later, crippled and forever changed by the violence inflicted upon her. And then there was Jordan. He had vanished into the tangled wilderness, leaving behind only a trail of questions and guilt. In the aftermath, as we gathered what little strength remained, the haunting whispers of the swamp and the malevolent presence of the swamp hag lingered in every shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal had only just begun. The betrayal, the violence, and the inexplicable terror had fractured us in ways that no amount of time or healing could fully mend. Dylan's revelations about the cult and the dark forces at work left me wondering if we had merely scratched the surface of a far deeper evil that lay hidden in the Mississippi backwoods. In the weeks that followed, I found myself drawn back to the swamp in search of answers. Mia, though physically present, was a shell of her former self, her eyes always distant, haunted by memories too painful to share. Dylan and I began to piece together the true extent of the cult's operations and the ominous legacy of the swamp hag. We discovered that the cult was not an isolated aberration, but part of a larger, insidious network that had roots in centuries-old rituals and a deep, abiding connection to the land. The weight of that knowledge was heavy on my soul. Every night, as I lay awake in an uncertain future, the echoes of that fateful weekend reverberated through my mind. I could still hear Mia's tortured cries, Casey's desperate screams, and even the sound of Jordan's last whispered apologies, lost in the rustle of the wind. In the end, survival came at a terrible cost, and the isolation of the backwoods had revealed a darkness within both the land and the human heart. Now, as I sit here in the quiet aftermath of it all, I know that some secrets are better left undisturbed. The swamp holds its mysteries close, and the legacy of the swamp hag remains a chilling reminder of the thin line between folklore and horrifying reality. My name is Alex Carter, and what happened in those dark, humid nights in Mississippi changed me forever. The horror of betrayal, the agony of loss, and the relentless pursuit of something unspeakably evil still haunt my every step, a testament to the fact that sometimes the darkest nightmares are all too real. My name is Ethan Reynolds. I'm 42 years old, and this happened during one of the darkest weekends of my life, deep in the bayou near Vicksburg, Mississippi. I set out in my old RV, a creaking, unreliable hulk that matched my own battered state of mind, with the hope that solitude would help me confront the ghosts of my past. I was a war veteran, haunted by memories and guilt I could never quite shake, and I desperately needed a chance at redemption. The drive was long and lonesome. The humid Mississippi heat pressed in on me as I navigated winding back roads, my thoughts drifting back to a tragedy during my service, a mistake that cost lives and left me with a heavy burden of regret. I clung to the belief that isolation might force a reckoning, a catharsis that I had long denied myself. Almost as soon as I pulled into a secluded spot along the Mississippi River, near a long-forgotten RV campsite bordered by dense bayou woods, the RV began to betray me. It sputtered, its engine failing intermittently as if echoing the fragmented state of my mind. I knew that with each breakdown, my isolation would grow deeper, and I might be forced to confront more than just my own inner demons. That first night, the oppressive heat of the day gave way to a thick, stifling humidity. I sat alone in the dim interior of my RV, trying to ignore the persistent clamor of mechanical issues. But as darkness crept in, I began to notice something else. A whispering on the humid air that didn't quite match the sounds of the bayou. At first, I thought it was the wind, rustling through the cypress trees. But soon I heard what seemed like soft, anguished cries, as if someone, or something, was mourning a long-lost sorrow. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of my weary mind, fueled by memories and too much alcohol, but then I saw her. In the corner of my eye, just outside a grimy window, I caught a glimpse of a spectral figure. A woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by shadows, standing motionless by the water's edge. I rubbed my eyes, questioning whether I was hallucinating, but when I looked again, she was still there, her pale form illuminated briefly by the flicker of the RV's failing lights. The next morning, I ventured out to a rundown gas station in a nearby town, hoping for answers and a chance to fix my vehicle. The place was deserted, its air heavy with secrets. The local handyman, an old man with weathered skin and a quiet, haunted look in his eyes, told me in a low, measured tone that I should be wary. He said the ghostly figure I'd seen was known as the Lady in White, a tragic spirit said to haunt these bayou lands after a terrible injustice. He warned me that her sorrow was not something to be taken lightly, and that those who lingered too long in her domain often found themselves trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret. I returned to my RV with a growing sense of foreboding. The engine still coughed and sputtered, and I was forced to rely on its intermittent operation as I tried to piece together the handyman's words with the inexplicable visions I'd encountered. That night, as the humid darkness enveloped me again, I sat silently in the RV, my eyes fixed on the window. I tried to summon courage from the depths of my memories, but instead the past rose unbidden. A montage of grim faces and echoes of orders given too hastily. I remembered the weight of responsibility, the lives lost, and how the guilt had followed me since. Then, without warning, the Lady in White returned. This time, she wasn't just a distant apparition by the window, she was inside the RV with me. I froze as the temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the sudden cold. Her eyes met mine, empty, sorrowful, yet filled with a silent accusation. I felt as if she were forcing me to relive the worst moments of my past. Doors slammed on their own, and objects began to move without reason, swirling around in a chaotic dance that blurred the lines between reality and delusion. I spent that night in a tortured state, alternating between fighting the terror of my own mind and the undeniable presence of this ghost. The incessant clamor of the RV's failing systems only heightened my sense of isolation, trapping me in a prison of metal and memories. I began to question whether the haunting was real or a manifestation of my deepest guilt, an external echo of the internal torment that had haunted me since that fateful day in the service. Desperation finally drove me out of the RV. Clutching a battered flashlight, I stepped into the dark bayou, determined to confront the spirit that tormented me. The humid air was thick with the scent of decaying vegetation, and every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart into a frantic rhythm. I navigated the narrow, muddy paths by the river, guided by an inexplicable pull toward an old, abandoned chapel that I had heard about. A relic from a bygone era rumored to be connected to the lady in white's tragic past. The path was treacherous. The ground was soft and unsteady beneath my boots, and the dense foliage seemed to close in, as if the bayou itself were trying to swallow me whole. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and every creak of the old trees echoed like the moans of the dead. I wasn't sure if the oppressive feeling was due to the supernatural or the sheer loneliness of the wilderness, but I pressed on, desperate for answers. When I finally reached the chapel, it loomed before me, a crumbling stone structure half swallowed by vines and moss. Its once grand facade was marred by the passage of time, yet it exuded a quiet sorrow that resonated with my own heart. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of incense and old prayers. I found a dusty altar, its surface scarred by the rituals of long-forgotten devotions. It was here, amid relics of a sorrowful past, that I encountered the lady in white once more. She stood before me, ethereal and anguished, her presence both beautiful and terrifying. As I stared into her hollow eyes, fragments of memory and guilt came crashing down on me. Visions of a fateful night when I had made a decision that cost innocent lives. The weight of my guilt was palpable, almost suffocating, and I realized with dawning horror that her appearance was not merely a supernatural anomaly, but a manifestation of my own inner torment. In that dilapidated chapel, I was forced into a confrontation with my past. I pleaded silently for forgiveness, for absolution, not just from the ghostly figure, but from the part of myself that had betrayed so many. The air around me shimmered as if charged with energy, and for a long moment, time seemed to suspend. The lady in white's form wavered, her sorrowful eyes softening, and in that fleeting moment, I sensed a profound connection between her anguish and my own. But the night was not kind. The RV, my only connection to the world I'd once known, remained a broken symbol of my inability to move forward. With its constant mechanical failures echoing my inner decay, I felt trapped between two worlds, the realm of the living and the haunting specters of my past. I realized that I had no choice but to accept the painful truth that the spirit before me was as much a part of me as my guilt. A reminder that some sins cannot be erased, only confronted and perhaps slowly forgiven. After what felt like an eternity, the oppressive energy in the chapel began to subside. The lady in white faded into the shadows, leaving me alone with the echoes of whispered prayers and my own anguished thoughts. I don't know if I truly exorcised the ghost, or if I merely found a way to coexist with the memories that had plagued me for so long. What I do know is that my journey through the bayou became a crucible, a place where the line between reality and delusion blurred, and where I was forced to confront the darkest parts of myself. I eventually returned to my RV, the broken vehicle now a testament to my failed attempts to outrun my past. The nights continued to be haunted by faint whispers and the occasional distant glimpse of that spectral woman. But over time, as I patched up the RV with my own 2 hands and began the slow, painful process of forgiving myself, the terrors lessened. The bayou, with all its eerie beauty and lurking sorrow, had become a mirror reflecting my inner scars, and in facing them I started to learn that redemption is a journey, not a destination. Now I sit in the quiet of the bayou, watching the slow dance of mist over the Mississippi River. The memories of that harrowing weekend still linger, each whisper of the wind and each creak of the old RV a reminder of the past I can never entirely escape. But in those same moments, I also see a glimmer of hope. I have learned that the most terrifying ghosts are not the ones that haunt abandoned chapels or lonely campsites, but the ones we carry within ourselves. My name is Ethan Reynolds, and this was the weekend that changed everything. In the suffocating darkness of the Mississippi Bayou, I came face to face with my own guilt, and in that confrontation, I found the courage to begin the slow, arduous process of redemption. The lady in white may still wander these lonely trails, a symbol of unending sorrow, but now I see her as a part of me, a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are fought within, and that even in isolation, there is a path toward forgiveness and, eventually, peace. My name is Mark Lawson. I'm 45 years old, and this happened on a cold, desolate night along Devil's Road in Pontotoc County, Mississippi. I was a former detective, haunted by the disappearance of my sister, a case that had gone cold and left me with a relentless need for answers. My old RV, a creaking metal shell that had seen better days, was my reluctant companion on a journey fueled by sorrow and desperate hope. I had driven for hours along a lonely stretch of highway, the road barely illuminated by the dying light of dusk. The further I ventured into this forsaken part of the state, the more I felt the weight of local lore pressing in on me. Tales of a devilish pact, cursed souls, and a mysterious entity that preyed on the desperate had circulated among the locals. I wasn't a superstitious man by nature, but grief has a way of making you believe in things you never imagined. Almost immediately after I pulled off the highway into an abandoned RV campsite near a dilapidated roadside chapel, my RV began acting up. The engine coughed and spluttered, lights flickered ominously, and I found inexplicable symbols, like twisted, devilish runes, etched crudely into the walls of the interior. They were unfamiliar, yet disturbingly deliberate. I recalled overhearing rumors in a nearby diner about a curse that befell those who dared to meddle in the dark secrets of Devil's Road. I wasn't deterred. I needed to follow every lead, even if it meant enduring the inconvenience of a failing vehicle. With my RV's unreliable state isolating me further, I decided to step out and get a closer look. The night air was cold, and the silence was broken only by the distant howling of wind and the occasional creak of old metal. I tried to fix a loose connection under the dashboard, but the RV seemed determined to keep its secrets hidden. The next morning, I sought out answers at a rundown diner in a nearby town. The place was dim and sparsely populated, a few weary faces, eyes that told tales of hardship and whispered warnings. Over a cup of bitter coffee, I listened as a local man, his voice low and gravelly, told me about Devil's Road. He spoke of a notorious stretch of highway where desperate souls made bargains with something they called the devil. He warned me that some secrets are best left buried and that my sister's disappearance might be entwined with forces beyond mortal comprehension. I left the diner with a growing sense of dread mixed with determination. My RV's troubles had worsened. Mechanical failures, compounded by eerie occurrences, forced me to abandon it one dark, stormy evening. I was now on foot, trekking through barren, windswept stretches of road and desolate woodland, following cryptic clues that seemed to draw me ever deeper into a labyrinth of local myth and personal torment. It was on one of these grim nights that I encountered him, a mysterious stranger who emerged from the shadows along the roadside. He was rugged, with a hardened face and eyes that seemed to hold a mix of sorrow and unspoken knowledge. In a gravelly tone, he introduced himself simply as Cole. He claimed he'd once escaped the clutches of the devil's pact and now roamed these parts, offering guidance to those foolish enough to seek forbidden truths. His presence was both reassuring and unsettling. I sensed he was hiding dark secrets of his own. Cole walked with me for a while, sharing fragments of his story about the cult of desperate souls who had once struck a bargain with an entity beyond human reckoning. According to him, this cult had been responsible for sacrifices, people who, in their despair, had been offered up to the devil. As we spoke, he hinted that my sister's fate might have been sealed by the same unholy covenant. The revelation struck me like a blow, igniting a cocktail of anger, grief, and terror in equal measure. But the night's horrors were far from over. While investigating an abandoned farmhouse for further clues, I was ambushed by a group of vigilante locals. They were hardened, paranoid, and convinced that anyone meddling in the cursed mysteries of Devil's Road was a sympathizer of the cult that had once roamed these parts. They captured me without mercy, subjecting me to a brutal interrogation and torture that left my body battered and my spirit nearly broken. The pain was excruciating, both physical and emotional, as they hurled accusations and threats in a language I couldn't fully comprehend. It was during this torment that I began to wonder if my relentless search had doomed me from the start. In the midst of my suffering, Cole reappeared. His timely intervention, or so it seemed at first, brought a fleeting glimmer of hope. But as I lay there, weakened and desperate, Cole's true allegiance revealed itself. In a chilling moment of betrayal, he admitted that he was no savior but an agent of the cult. With a cold, almost detached tone, he explained that my sister had been one of their sacrifices, a pawn in a sinister game of power and despair. His words cut deeper than any physical blow, shattering what little trust I had left. Under the relentless pressure of pain and despair, the cult members coerced me into considering an unthinkable proposition, a final, desperate bargain with the devil himself. They promised that if I agreed, I could have my sister back, if only for a fleeting moment, at the terrible price of damning my own soul for eternity. I felt the noose of temptation tighten around me, my grief and longing battling with the instinct for self-preservation. Every fiber of my being screamed to refuse, yet the thought of never knowing what had happened to my sister, of living forever with unanswered questions, gnawed at me relentlessly. I knew that the key to my sister's fate lay in the old, abandoned roadside chapel, a crumbling relic where the original pact had been sealed. With the cult's influence closing in and my body and mind teetering on the edge, I made my way to that forsaken place. The chapel was a decrepit structure, its once holy walls stained with the remnants of dark rituals and desperate prayers. It exuded a palpable aura of decay and malevolence. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the stench of incense and the weight of countless souls lost to despair. Flickering candlelight revealed faded murals depicting ominous symbols and scenes of torment. I could almost hear the echo of voices, pleading, accusing, and weeping, resonating through the hollow space. In the center of the chapel, I confronted the manifestation of the devil, a presence so palpable it seemed to twist the very fabric of reality. The air around me grew heavy, and I could feel an unseen force probing the depths of my soul. It whispered promises of reunion, of finally unraveling the mystery of my sister's disappearance. I stood frozen, torn between the desperate yearning for closure and the instinctive terror of condemning myself to eternal damnation. The presence was relentless, its voice both seductive and terrifying, offering a bargain that no grieving heart should ever consider. In that excruciating moment, with sweat mingling with tears and my mind awash with agonizing memories, I made my choice. I refused the devil's bargain. I could not, in good conscience, trade my soul for a fleeting glimpse of what I had lost. The decision came with an almost unbearable weight, a final, shattering blow to everything I thought I had known. The presence howled in fury, and for a moment I felt as if the very walls of the chapel would collapse upon me. The ensuing chaos was a blur of blinding light, agonized screams, and the thunder of collapsing stone. When the tumult subsided, I found myself alone in the ruined sanctuary, the malevolent presence having receded into the shadows. My body was broken, my spirit scarred, and the unanswered questions about my sister's fate remained a painful, unyielding burden. I eventually staggered out of the chapel and returned to the remnants of my RV, a shattered shell that now symbolized the ruin of my past and the impossibility of reclaiming what was lost. The journey along Devil's Road had ended in a confrontation with the darkest aspects of human and supernatural depravity. I carried the scars of betrayal and torture, a bitter reminder of the cost of seeking forbidden truths. Now, as I sit alone under a waning moon, the desolate highway stretching out before me, I am left with a haunting ambiguity. I never learned the full truth about what happened to my sister, only that the devil's pact and the cult's sinister machinations left a wound that may never heal. My search for closure continues, but it is now tempered by the knowledge that some secrets are best left undisturbed, and that every bargain with darkness exacts a price far greater than we can ever imagine. My name is Mark Lawson, and I walked Devil's Road in search of answers, only to find that the path to truth is paved with torment, betrayal, and the unyielding shadow of the devil himself. I now bear the weight of that terrible night, a constant reminder that some mysteries should remain forever shrouded in darkness.